There are confessions that free the soul, and then there are confessions that reveal something so monstrous, so incomprehensibly evil, that they shatter everything we thought we knew about the darkness living among us. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where the stories get darker and the truth cuts deeper. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're diving into 4 chilling stories you don't want to miss. If you enjoy these late-night truths, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow and keeps these stories alive. This is the story of the confession killer. Now, relax, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. The interrogation room stank of stale coffee and lies. Across a scratched metal table sat a man whose lazy eye drifted while the other held steady, a predator's gaze wrapped in a drifter's disguise. When Texas Rangers asked Henry Lee Lucas how many people he'd killed, his answer came with the casual indifference of someone reciting a grocery list. Maybe 100, could be more. The year was 1983, and what began as a routine murder confession would spiral into the most controversial killing spree in American criminal history. But here's what kept investigators awake at night, what made seasoned detectives question their own sanity. Henry Lee Lucas didn't just confess to murders. He confessed to hundreds of them. Crimes scattered across 19 states, each more brutal than the last, each described with such precise, horrifying detail that grown men left the room to vomit. Was he America's most prolific serial killer, a one-eyed monster who carved a trail of blood across the heartland? Or was he something even more disturbing, a compulsive liar who understood that in the theater of American violence, the most captivating performance is a confession? The truth, when it finally emerged, would prove more terrifying than either possibility. Because Henry Lee Lucas, aka the confession killer, didn't just kill people. He killed the truth itself, and in doing so, exposed a criminal justice system so desperate for closure, so hungry for convictions, that it willingly fed a monster, and then called him a hero. Henry Lee Lucas drew his first breath on August 23, 1936, in a rotting one-room cabin outside Blacksburg, Virginia, a place where hope went to die in misery through parties. His mother, Viola, was a woman whose cruelty knew no boundaries, a prostitute who entertained men in the same room where her children tried to sleep, their small bodies curled against the wall while grunts and whispers filled the darkness. She dressed young Henry in girls' clothing, sent him to school in curled hair and dresses, laughing as other children beat him bloody on the playground. This wasn't discipline. This was calculated psychological torture, the systematic destruction of a child's soul, brick by agonizing brick. His father, Anderson Lucas, was a double amputee railroad worker who'd lost both legs in an accident. A broken man married to a woman whose favorite pastime was breaking others. Anderson couldn't protect his son because he couldn't protect himself. He'd crawl across the floor on stumps wrapped in leather padding while Viola shrieked obscenities and swung whatever object her fingers found first. Henry watched his father's humiliation daily, learned that weakness invited violence, that love was just another word for pain. The beatings young Henry endured weren't simple punishments. They were theatrical productions of sadism. Viola would strike his head with lumber, with skillets, with the blunt edge of whatever rage demanded. One particularly savage assault left him unconscious for 3 days, his young brain swelling against his skull, permanently damaging tissue that controlled impulse and empathy. When he finally woke, something essential had been erased, replaced by a vast emptiness that would spend decades searching for ways to fill itself. At 10 years old, Henry's half-brother introduced him to bestiality and sexual violence, showing him that living creatures existed solely for domination and disposal. This wasn't experimentation. This was education in monstrosity, a masterclass in dehumanization. Henry practiced on animals first, slitting throats, watching eyes glaze over, feeling that momentary rush of absolute control over life and death. He'd carry small corpses into the woods, arrange them in positions, study how blood pooled and congealed, how flesh decomposed under the Virginia sun. School offered no refuge. The other children called him retarded, mocked his wandering eye, remembered the dresses and curls from earlier years. Teachers saw a dirty, neglected child with cognitive delays and simply looked away. One less problem in classrooms already bursting with Appalachian poverty's damaged offspring. Henry stopped attending altogether by age 14, spending his days wandering dirt roads, sleeping in abandoned buildings, stealing what he needed to survive. His first brush with murder came in 1951 when he was just 15. Local police suspected him in the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl, Laura Burnsley, last seen talking with the Lucas boy near the railroad tracks. Her body turned up 3 weeks later in a culvert, strangled and violated. Her face bloated beyond recognition from exposure to the elements. Investigators questioned Henry for hours, but without physical evidence and with a boy who could barely string coherent sentences together, the case went cold. Henry walked free, carrying the secret knowledge that he could kill and get away with it, that the system designed to stop monsters like him was operated by people too tired or too incompetent to connect the obvious dots. The violence escalated predictably. Henry spent his late teens cycling through juvenile facilities for burglary, assault, car theft, crimes that seemed almost quaint compared to what churned inside him. Prison became his graduate school, where older convicts taught him how to move between states, how to avoid leaving evidence, how to identify victims nobody would miss. Drifters, prostitutes, runaways, America's invisible population, people who could vanish without triggering Amber Alerts or extensive investigations. January 11, 1960. The night Henry Lee Lucas stopped being Viola's victim and became her executioner. 23 years old, released from prison just weeks earlier, Henry showed up at his mother's Tecumseh, Michigan, home drunk and spoiling for confrontation. What started as an argument about his lifestyle, Viola screaming about his laziness, his worthlessness, threatening to have him locked up again, exploded into physical violence. But this time, Henry didn't cower. This time, he fought back. The exact sequence remains disputed. Henry claimed self-defense, said his mother came at him with a broom, that he merely pushed her away and she struck her head. Prosecutors painted a more sinister picture. Henry grabbing a knife, stabbing his mother in the neck, watching her bleed out on the kitchen floor while he finished his drink. The autopsy revealed multiple wounds. Defensive injuries on her hands suggesting she tried to fight off her attacker. A deep laceration across her throat that severed the carotid artery, causing her to drown in her own blood within minutes. He received 40 years for second-degree murder but served only 10. Released in 1970, Henry Lee Lucas walked out of prison a 33-year-old man with no family, no job prospects, no ties to anything resembling normal human society. He drifted across America like a ghost, working odd jobs just long enough to earn gas money, sleeping in his car or cheap motels, moving constantly, hunting constantly, killing constantly, or so he would later claim. The years between 1970 and 1983 remain shrouded in conflicting narratives. What's certain, Henry Lee Lucas met Otis Toole, a Jacksonville arsonist and cannibal, at a soup kitchen in 1976. Toole was intellectually disabled, violently impulsive, and sexually fluid, a dangerous combination that found perfect resonance with Henry's particular pathology. Together, they formed a partnership that would allegedly terrorize the nation, though separating fact from fiction in their shared mythology requires a machete and considerable skepticism. Toole introduced Henry to his young niece, Frida Becky Powell, a child whose life had already been saturated with abuse and neglect. When Becky turned 13, she and Henry began what he described as a romantic relationship, statutory rape by any legal or moral standard. They traveled together as a grotesque surrogate family. Henry, Becky, and occasionally Otis, roaming the highways of America, picking up victims like roadside trash. The pattern was devastatingly simple. Identify someone vulnerable, offer assistance or companionship, isolate them, then unleash violence so extreme that victims often died from shock before the actual killing blow landed. Henry claimed to favor strangulation, said he enjoyed watching the exact moment life left the eyes, that split second when a person transitions from being to nothingness. Sometimes he'd sexually assault victims post-mortem, maintaining that dead bodies didn't complain or judge. Other times, He'd simply dump the corpse in a ditch and drive away, already scanning for the next opportunity. But everything changed on March 12, 1982, the night Henry Lee Lucas murdered the only person he claimed to love. The circumstances surrounding Becky Powell's death shift depending on which version of Henry's confession you believe. In one telling, they argued because the 15-year-old wanted to return to Florida, wanted stability and something resembling a normal life. Henry, unable to process rejection even from a traumatized child, grabbed her in a rage. In another version, the killing was almost tender. He said she asked him to end her suffering, that she was tired of running, tired of the violence. What remains consistent? Henry struck Becky with a knife, stabbed her multiple times, then sexually violated her corpse. He dismembered her body with a saw, scattering pieces across a field outside Denton, Texas. Some parts he buried. Others he left for scavengers. When investigators finally recovered the remains months later, they found only fragments. A partial skull, several bones, not enough to reconstruct who this child had been before Henry Lucas decided she'd served her purpose. The weight of Becky's murder, or perhaps simply the exhaustion of running, led Henry to turn himself in on June 11, 1983. Initially arrested for weapons violations, he sat in a Montague County, Texas jail cell and started talking. And talking. And talking. The confessions poured out like water from a burst dam, each more horrifying than the last, painting a portrait of American violence so comprehensive, so geographically diverse, so numerically staggering that investigators didn't know whether to celebrate their good fortune or question their sanity. Henry Lee Lucas was about to become the most confessed serial killer in history, and the American criminal justice system was about to become his most willing accomplice. The interrogation room at the Montague County Sheriff's Office became Henry Lee Lucas's stage, and he performed like his life depended on it, because it did. What began as a simple confession to killing Becky Powell metastasized into something unprecedented in American law enforcement history. A confessional marathon that would eventually encompass over 600 murders, spanning nearly 2 decades and touching almost every state in the continental United States. Rangers, detectives, and FBI agents lined up for their turn with Henry, each carrying case files thick with unsolved homicides, desperate for closure, for answers, for anything that might bring peace to families who'd spent years haunted by absence. Henry understood the transaction immediately. Talk and they'd treat him well. Confess and he'd become valuable. Provide details and he'd transform from disposable drifter into the most important prisoner in the Texas justice system. So he talked. Dear God, did he talk? The early confessions carried the ring of terrible truth. Henry described killing Kate Rich, an 80-year-old woman he'd briefly worked for in Ringgold, Texas. He'd been released from prison and was living with Otis Toole's family when he met Kate, a widow who hired him for odd jobs. On September 16, 1982, Henry offered to drive Kate to church. She never arrived. Henry confessed to stabbing her, raping her corpse, then dismembering her body and burning the pieces in a wood stove at the House of Prayer, a religious commune where he'd been staying. Investigators found bone fragments in the stove's ashes, dental work that matched Kate Rich's records, wedding ring remnants fused with human remains. The Becky Powell confession came next, Henry leading investigators to the field where he'd scattered her remains, describing details only the killer could know. The pattern of her dress, the birthmark on her shoulder, the way she'd begged him to stop even as the knife plunged again and again. These confessions were solid, backed by physical evidence, witnessed by multiple investigators. They should have been enough to satisfy justice. They should have been where the story ended. But Henry Lee Lucas had tasted something intoxicating. Attention, respect, the power that comes from making important people hang on your every word. And the law enforcement officers surrounding him. Exhausted, frustrated men carrying binders full of cold cases that haunted their careers, desperately wanted what Henry offered. They wanted resolution. They wanted to tell grieving families that the monster had been caught, that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. So Henry kept confessing, and investigators kept believing him. The Texas Rangers established a dedicated task force with Henry Lucas at its center. They gave him special privileges: better food, unlimited cigarettes, coffee whenever he wanted it, his own television. They drove him around the state in unmarked cars, letting him point out crime scenes, treating him not like a prisoner but like a consultant, a valued expert in the field of murder. Henry reveled in it, describing kills with such precise brutality that detectives would rush from the room, unable to stomach the images his words conjured. He confessed to killing prostitutes along the Interstate 35 corridor, said he'd strangle them during sex, dump their bodies in ditches like discarded fast food wrappers. He confessed to murdering hitchhikers, claimed he'd pick them up, drive them to isolated areas, then beat them to death with tire irons, rocks, his bare fists, whatever the moment provided. He confessed to killing entire families, said he'd break into homes, slaughter parents in their beds, then murder the children to eliminate witnesses, describing the sounds they made, the way blood looked black in moonlight filtering through bedroom windows. Some confessions were genuinely chilling in their specificity. Henry described killing a young woman outside Georgetown, Texas, said he'd shot her, then returned to the body 3 days later to have sex with the decomposing remains. When investigators checked, they found a case matching every detail. Victim's name, location, cause of death, the 3-day gap before discovery. Henry's confession closed a case that had tormented the Georgetown Police Department for 2 years. He confessed to the Orange Socks murder, an unidentified woman found dead along Interstate 35, her only identifying feature a pair of bright orange socks. Henry described picking her up as a hitchhiker, strangling her during sex, dumping her body on the roadside. The details matched: location, position of the body, cause of death. Prosecutors charged him. A jury convicted him, and Henry Lee Lucas landed on death row for killing a woman whose real name nobody even knew. But cracks began appearing in Henry's confessional edifice almost immediately, hairline fractures that would eventually shatter the entire structure. A journalist named Hugh Ainsworth started asking uncomfortable questions. How could Henry have committed murders in Texas and Florida on the same day? How did a man who couldn't read or write keep track of hundreds of victims across 19 states? Why did Henry's confessions always match what investigators told him about their cases before he started talking? Ainsworth discovered something devastating. Law enforcement agencies were feeding Henry details. They'd show him crime scene photos, describe the victims, explain how the murders happened, then act shocked when Henry confessed to crimes using the exact information they just provided. The investigators weren't being malicious. They were being human, desperate to solve cases that had haunted them for years, willing to overlook inconsistencies if it meant finally writing closed on thick file folders gathering dust in evidence rooms. Henry understood the game perfectly. Detectives would arrive with their unsolved cases, hoping for a confession. Henry would ask questions, gather details, then feed them back in the form of a confession, embellishing with gruesome details he'd picked up from crime magazines, television shows, and conversations with other inmates. If the details didn't quite match, investigators would help him remember correctly, adjusting Henry's confession to fit the evidence. It was a folie à deux, a shared delusion between a killer craving attention and a system craving closure. The Texas Rangers' Lucas Task Force became a traveling roadshow. They'd transport Henry to different states, where local police would present their cold cases. Henry confessed to murders in Michigan, California, Oklahoma, Louisiana, killing sprees that would have required superhuman travel capabilities. He confessed to murders committed while he was provably incarcerated in other states. He confessed to killing people who turned up alive years later. He confessed to over 600 murders, making him statistically the most prolific serial killer in world history, surpassing even the most extreme estimates for killers like Harold Shipman or Luis Garavito. But statistics don't lie even when serial killers do. Researchers began calculating the logistics of Henry's claimed murder spree. To have committed 600 murders between 1975 and 1983, Henry would have needed to kill someone approximately every 4 days, every single day for 8 straight years, while simultaneously working jobs, maintaining relationships, serving jail time for other offenses, and driving thousands of miles across the country in vehicles that barely functioned. The numbers didn't just fail to add up, they laughed at basic mathematics. Yet convictions kept rolling in. Prosecutors in multiple states charged Henry with murders based solely on his confessions, without physical evidence, without witnesses, without anything except Henry's word and investigators' desperate need to believe him. Defense attorneys barely fought back, perhaps assuming their client was guilty of something, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer volume of accusations. Juries heard Henry's detailed confessions and delivered guilty verdicts, never hearing about the cases where his confessions contradicted physical impossibilities. Henry played different roles depending on his audience. With some investigators, he was remorseful, tearfully describing how killing haunted him, how he wished he could take back the violence. With others, he was boastful, treating murder like a competition he'd won, tallying victims like baseball statistics. He gave interviews to journalists, speaking eloquently about his motivations, his psychology, his place in criminal history. A remarkable performance for someone supposedly intellectually disabled with minimal education. The apex of Henry's confession tour came when he claimed partnership with Otis Toole in the murder of Adam Walsh, the 6-year-old boy whose 1981 abduction from a Hollywood, Florida, shopping mall sparked national outrage and inspired his father, John Walsh, to create America's Most Wanted. Henry described snatching the child, gave details about the killing, led investigators to where he claimed they dumped the body. For years, this confession provided the Walsh family with a form of closure, horrible as it was, at least they knew. Except Henry Lucas didn't kill Adam Walsh. Otis Toole likely did, acting alone, but Henry's involvement was pure fabrication, another performance in his ongoing theater of false confessions. The Adam Walsh case exemplified everything wrong with the Lucas confessions. Desperate investigators, grieving families seeking answers, and a manipulative killer who understood that claiming responsibility for high-profile murders guaranteed maximum attention. By 1985, cracks had become chasms. Attorney General Jim Maddox launched an investigation into the Lucas Task Force, eventually concluding that Henry Lucas was a pathological liar, responsible for perhaps 3 murders. His mother, Becky Powell, and Kate Rich, but certainly not the hundreds he'd claimed. The investigation revealed systematic problems. Investigators had violated proper interrogation protocols, shared case details with Henry before taking confessions, and in some instances, actively coached him toward desired answers. The backlash was swift and brutal. Law enforcement agencies that had closed cases based on Henry's confessions now faced the prospect of reopening them, admitting they'd been fooled, telling families that the closure they'd received was built on lies. Some agencies refused, maintaining that Henry's confessions were legitimate despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Others quietly dropped charges, hoping nobody would notice their complicity in the farce. Henry Lucas reveled in the chaos. He recanted his confessions, then reconfessed, then recanted again, jerking the justice system around like a puppet on strings. In one interview, he admitted to lying about most murders, claiming he'd only killed 3 people. In another, he insisted every confession was true, that the doubters were protecting the real killers. He understood that confusion was its own form of power, that by making the truth unknowable, he'd achieved a form of immortality. The man who'd spent his childhood as Viola Lucas's punching bag, mocked and humiliated and dressed in girls' clothing, had discovered the ultimate revenge, making the entire American criminal justice system look foolish. Henry Lee Lucas didn't just confess to hundreds of murders. He confessed to crimes that exposed every weakness in law enforcement: the desperation for closure, the willingness to cut corners, the profound failure to protect truth in service of conviction statistics. And through it all, real victims remained unidentified, real families stayed tormented by absence, and real killers walked free because investigators had been too busy listening to Henry Lucas's fairy tales to chase actual evidence. The confession killer's greatest victims weren't the people he murdered. They were the ones whose deaths he falsely claimed, whose cases would remain forever tainted by his lies, whose families would never know if justice had truly been served or if they'd simply been fed another helping of Henry's elaborate fiction. Behind every false confession Henry Lee Lucas spun, there existed a real victim, someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone who'd once laughed and dreamed and felt sunshine on their face before violence erased their future. These people deserved justice, Instead, they got Henry Lucas, a pathological liar who turned their deaths into narrative entertainment, who reduced their murders to props in his ongoing performance. The tragedy wasn't just that Henry confessed to crimes he didn't commit. The tragedy was that his lies meant their real killers might never face consequences, that their cases became poisoned fruit nobody wanted to touch. Consider the case of Deborah Jackson, a 23-year-old woman found strangled in her Shreveport, Louisiana, apartment on July 10, 1977. Henry confessed to killing her, described the apartment's layout, claimed he'd knocked on her door asking for water, then forced his way inside. Investigators were thrilled, a cold case solved. They closed the file, informed Deborah's family that her killer had been caught, let everyone move forward believing justice had been served. Except Henry Lucas was in Maryland on July 10, 1977, provably incarcerated on parole violations. Prison records, court documents, multiple witnesses placed him hundreds of miles away. The Shreveport Police Department had closed a murder case based on a confession that was physically impossible. When this emerged years later, they quietly reopened the investigation, but the trail had gone ice cold. Evidence had been discarded, witnesses had died or moved away, and the real killer, whoever had strangled Deborah Jackson in her own home, had enjoyed years of freedom because everyone believed Henry's lies. Multiply that case by hundreds. Hundreds of families told their loved one's killer had been caught. Hundreds of investigations abandoned because Henry Lucas confessed. Hundreds of real murderers walking free, perhaps killing again, emboldened by the knowledge that some delusional drifter was taking credit for their work. Then there were the murders Henry actually committed, the ones that should have been straightforward prosecutions but became complicated by the avalanche of false confessions. Kate Rich's family deserved closure without questioning whether Henry's confession was reliable. Becky Powell's scattered remains deserved dignity, not to be lumped together with hundreds of fabricated victims. Even Viola Lucas, monstrous as she was, deserved accurate documentation of how her son killed her, not surrounded by doubt because Henry had lied about everything else. The Orange Socks case epitomizes the tragedy. Convicted and sentenced to death for killing an unidentified woman, Henry spent years on death row for this murder. Later, when investigators re-examined the case, they discovered Henry had been in Florida when Orange Socks was killed in Texas. Work records, paycheck stubs, multiple witnesses confirmed his whereabouts. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles recommended commuting his death sentence, a rare acknowledgement that the state had nearly executed a man for a murder he physically couldn't have committed. Governor George W. Bush commuted Henry's death sentence to life imprisonment in 1998, the only time during his tenure as Texas governor that Bush showed such mercy. Think about that. The future president who would oversee more executions than any modern governor found the Lucas case so problematic, so riddled with doubt, that even he couldn't stomach the execution. That should tell you everything about the degree to which Henry's confessions had corrupted justice. But Orange Socks remained unidentified until 2019, when DNA technology finally revealed her identity. Deborah Jackson, a different Deborah Jackson than the Shreveport victim. A 23-year-old woman last seen in July 1980. Her family had spent 40 years not knowing what happened, wondering if she'd run away, if she'd started over somewhere, if she might still be alive. Henry Lucas's false confession meant investigators stopped looking for her real killer, stopped investigating her background, stopped doing the hard work that might have identified her decades earlier. How many other Orange Socks cases exist? How many unidentified victims remain nameless because investigators were satisfied with Henry's confession and never pushed harder? The National Missing and Unresolved Cases database contains thousands of unidentified remains, many from the era of Henry's rampage, real or imagined. Some might be his legitimate victims. Most probably aren't. But his lies poisoned the entire dataset, making it nearly impossible to separate genuine leads from false confessions. The psychological toll on victims' families was incalculable. Imagine receiving a call from detectives saying they'd caught your daughter's killer, feeling that rush of relief mixed with grief, finally having someone to direct your rage toward, and then learning years later that the confession was probably false, that your daughter's real killer remained unknown. that the closure you'd felt was just another lie. Some families went through this cycle multiple times as Henry confessed, recanted, reconfessed, and recanted again. Rita Salazar's family endured this nightmare. The 14-year-old vanished from her Scottsdale, Arizona, home in 1981. Henry confessed to killing her, said he'd picked her up hitchhiking, sexually assaulted her, then strangled her and dumped her body in the desert. Investigators located remains matching Rita's description. Her family held a funeral. Everyone moved forward believing Rita's killer was behind bars. Then doubts emerged about Henry's whereabouts. Then the confession fell apart. Then the family learned the remains they'd buried might not even be Rita because the identification had been rushed once Henry confessed. The Salazar family lived in limbo, haunted by uncertainty, unable to properly grieve because they couldn't even be certain their daughter was dead. And what about the killers who walked free? While investigators wasted resources processing Henry's false confessions, real serial killers continued operating. The Green River Killer murdered 49 women in Washington state during the early 1980s, operating freely while law enforcement focused on Henry Lucas in Texas. The Grim Sleeper killed across Los Angeles between 1985 and 2007, undetected for decades partly because agencies were overwhelmed with cold cases, many solved by Lucas confessions that later proved false. Henry's lies had a domino effect across American law enforcement. Departments that had closed cases based on his confessions had to reopen them, requiring resources, manpower, and funding that could have been spent on active investigations. District attorneys faced the embarrassing task of explaining to judges and juries that convictions obtained through Lucas confessions might be invalid. Defense attorneys filed appeals for clients convicted based on Henry's testimony, arguing that if he lied about hundreds of murders, how could any confession be trusted? The damage extended beyond individual cases. Henry Lee Lucas's confession spree eroded public trust in law enforcement's competency. People started questioning, if Texas Rangers could be fooled this thoroughly, this systematically, what else were they getting wrong? The answer, uncomfortable as it was, seemed to be quite a lot. The Lucas case revealed systematic failures in interrogation techniques, evidence handling, and prosecutorial oversight. Consider the psychological profile of the victims Henry falsely claimed. Many were sex workers women's society had already marginalized and devalued. Investigators were predisposed to believe these women could be victims of a drifter like Henry because they'd internalized biases about who makes a credible victim. A missing college student triggered massive investigations. A missing prostitute barely rated a police report. Henry understood this calculus, targeted his false confessions toward victims investigators would believe he'd kill. Poor women, hitchhikers, runaways, the invisible populations that America preferred to ignore. Some victims' families never learned the truth because investigators chose not to tell them. Departments that had publicly announced they'd solved cold cases through Lucas confessions quietly dropped the charges without press releases, without public acknowledgement, without giving families the truth they deserved. It was easier to let the lie stand than to admit the massive failure of justice. The few murders Henry actually committed, his mother, Kate Rich, Becky Powell, became almost lost in the noise. These victims deserved careful attention to the specific circumstances of their deaths, but instead they were lumped into the generic category of Lucas victims, indistinguishable from hundreds of fabricated kills. Becky Powell's murder was particularly horrific. A traumatized 15-year-old child, already a victim of incest and sexual exploitation, killed and dismembered by the adult man who'd been raping her for years. That crime deserved focused prosecution, detailed documentation, justice that acknowledged the specific ways Becky had suffered. Instead, her murder became just another item on Henry's confession list, trivialized by association with obvious fabrications. The ultimate insult came when true crime entertainment embraced Henry Lucas's mythology. Books, documentaries, television shows repeated his confessions uncritically, perpetuating the false narrative that America had survived its most prolific serial killer. Each retelling reinforced the lies, made it harder for victims' families to reclaim their loved ones' stories from Henry's distortions. The victims became characters in Henry's story rather than people with their own narratives, their own worth, their own right to be remembered accurately. Justice demands truth. The victims of Henry Lee Lucas, both the few he killed and the many he falsely claimed, deserved investigators who valued truth over closure, who would do the hard work of following evidence rather than accepting convenient confessions, who understood that every unsolved murder represented a real person whose life had value beyond their utility in clearing cold cases. Instead, they got a system that failed them twice. First, when they were murdered. Second, when Henry Lucas was allowed to appropriate their deaths for his own twisted purposes. Those victims remain footnotes in a larger story about systemic failure. They deserve better. They deserve justice. What they got was Henry Lee Lucas, and the stain of his lies may never fully wash away. Henry Lee Lucas arrived on death row at the Ellis Unit in Huntsville, Texas, in 1984, convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to die by lethal injection. He was 50 years old, his wandering eye filming over with cataracts, his body weakened by decades of alcohol abuse, poor nutrition, and the accumulated damage of a life lived violently. Most condemned prisoners arrived at Ellis Unit terrified, contemplating mortality, bargaining with whatever god they'd previously ignored. Not Henry. He arrived like a celebrity checking into a hotel, greeting guards by name, already familiar with the routines because he'd spent months working with Texas Rangers, traveling the state in relative comfort while confessing to murders. Death row should have been Henry's final performance. Instead, it became the stage for his greatest role reversal. The confessed serial killer who spent his remaining years insisting he'd lied about almost everything. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly. In early interviews, Henry maintained his guilt, described murders in his usual horrifying detail, played the role everyone expected. But as journalists like Hugh Ainsworth continued investigating, as the holes in his confessions became canyons, as the evidence mounted that law enforcement had been manipulated, Henry began a slow pivot. "I lied about most of them," he told a reporter in 1985. "I only killed 3 people. My mama, Becky, and Kate Rich. The rest was all bullshit." The admission should have triggered immediate relief. Families learning their loved ones' cases remained truly unsolved, a chance to pursue real leads instead of false confessions. Instead, it sparked chaos. Prosecutors who'd built careers on Lucas convictions denied any problems. Law enforcement agencies doubled down, insisting their investigations had been thorough, that Henry was now lying about lying, that the original confessions remained valid. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Henry Lucas was a manipulative psychopath who discovered that confessing to murders gave him power, privilege, and attention, 3 things he'd never possessed before. He was also a man who'd probably committed at least 3 murders, possibly more, though determining the exact number had become impossible given the contamination of evidence through hundreds of false confessions. Henry existed in a strange limbo, genuinely guilty but also genuinely lying, a killer who'd weaponized confessions in ways nobody had anticipated. Attorney General Jim Maddox's investigation confirmed what critical observers had known for years. The Lucas Task Force had been a disaster, a cautionary tale in how desperation for closure can corrupt entire investigations. Maddox's report documented systematic failures, investigators sharing case details before taking confessions, coaching Henry toward desired answers, ignoring timeline impossibilities, and dismissing physical evidence that contradicted confessions. The report concluded that Henry Lucas was a pathological liar who'd probably killed 3 people, but had been credited with hundreds of murders through a combination of his compulsive lying and law enforcement's willing suspension of disbelief. The fallout was spectacular. Texas Ranger Phil Ryan, who'd led the Lucas Task Force, defended his work vigorously, insisting that most confessions were legitimate despite evidence to the contrary. Other investigators quietly distanced themselves, hoping their involvement would be forgotten. District attorneys whose conviction rates had benefited from Lucas confessions faced uncomfortable questions about due process and evidentiary standards. Defense attorneys filed motions for new trials, arguing that convictions based on Lucas's testimony should be overturned given his documented unreliability. Henry watched the chaos with something approaching satisfaction. He transformed from victim to victimizer, from powerless to powerful, from forgotten drifter to the man who'd exposed the entire criminal justice system's vulnerability to manipulation. In interviews from death row, he oscillated between remorse and boasting, sometimes claiming he felt terrible about his lies, other times bragging about how easily he'd fooled everyone. The performance never stopped. Only the audience and script changed. The Orange Socks case became the focal point for Henry's death sentence scrutiny. Convicted in 1984 for killing the unidentified woman, Henry spent years on death row for this particular murder. As evidence mounted that he'd been in Florida when the murder occurred in Texas, even hardcore believers in Henry's guilt began questioning this specific conviction. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles conducted a review, an extraordinary step given Texas's enthusiasm for executions. Work records from a Jacksonville, Florida, roofing company showed Henry on the job during the time frame of the Orange Socks murder. Paychecks, time cards, employer testimony, multiple witnesses confirmed his presence over 1,000 miles from the crime scene. Prosecutors argued he could have driven to Texas, committed the murder, and returned to Florida, a timeline requiring superhuman endurance and ignoring the fact that Henry's vehicle was barely functional. The evidence was overwhelming. Henry Lucas could not have killed Orange Socks. Governor George W. Bush faced a decision that would define his gubernatorial legacy. Bush had overseen more executions than any modern Texas governor, built a reputation on being tough on crime, rarely granted clemency regardless of circumstances. The Lucas case presented a unique challenge. Executing a man for a murder he provably didn't commit would be judicial homicide, but granting clemency might imply that other Lucas convictions were equally questionable, which they were. On June 26, 1998, just days before Henry's scheduled execution, Bush commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment. The decision was narrow, focused specifically on the Orange Socks case, carefully avoiding broader questions about Henry's other convictions or the systematic failures that had produced them. Bush's statement emphasized that commutation wasn't exoneration. Henry Lucas was still a murderer, still deserved imprisonment, but shouldn't be executed for this particular crime given the reasonable doubt about his involvement. The commutation infuriated victims' families who believed Henry had killed their loved ones. To them, this was a technicality protecting a monster who deserved death. It frustrated law enforcement officers who'd worked the Lucas cases, interpreting the commutation as questioning their professional competency. It satisfied almost nobody, which might have been the only honest outcome available. Henry Lucas had created such a tangled mess of truth and lies that any decision would anger someone. Henry's remaining years were spent at the Ellis unit, no longer on death row but serving multiple life sentences with no possibility of parole. He worked in the prison factory, attended church services, gave occasional interviews to journalists and researchers still fascinated by his case. In these conversations, Henry presented different versions of himself. The remorseful killer seeking redemption, the misunderstood man who'd been railroaded by overzealous prosecutors, the folk hero who'd exposed corruption, the victim of his own success at lying. The most disturbing possibility, one Henry sometimes hinted at, was that he'd confessed to so many murders precisely to create reasonable doubt about all of them. If he was proven to have lied about hundreds of cases, courts might overturn convictions for murders he actually committed. The strategy had partial success. Several Lucas convictions were indeed overturned or dropped due to questionable evidence and timeline issues, including cases where he might have genuinely been involved. By poisoning the evidentiary well, Henry ensured that even his legitimate murders would be forever questioned. Prison psychologists evaluated Henry repeatedly, trying to understand the psychology of false confession. Their reports described a man with severe personality disorders, profound attachment issues stemming from childhood abuse, and an almost pathological need for attention and validation. Henry had discovered that being a serial killer or claiming to be one provided more respect, more human connection, more meaning than he'd ever experienced as a free man. Prison gave him structure, guaranteed meals, medical care, and an identity beyond white trash drifter. Why wouldn't he embrace that role, even if it meant dying behind bars? The law enforcement community slowly, grudgingly acknowledged the Lucas case as a massive failure. Police academies began teaching the case as an example of confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and the dangers of over-relying on confessions without corroborating physical evidence. The Lucas Task Force became shorthand for how not to conduct serial killer investigations, a cautionary tale taught to every new generation of detectives. The Federal Bureau of Investigation revised its guidelines for processing confessions from suspects claiming multiple murders, implementing safeguards designed to prevent another Lucas situation. But the damage was permanent. Hundreds of cases remained in limbo, officially closed based on Lucas confessions but lacking credible evidence, yet not actively investigated because departments lacked resources to restart cold case work. Families remained trapped in uncertainty, unable to mourn properly because they couldn't trust what they'd been told about their loved ones' deaths. Real killers walked free, emboldened by the knowledge that Henry Lucas had taken credit for their work. The American criminal justice system's credibility had been damaged, its vulnerabilities exposed for everyone to see. Henry Lee Lucas died on March 12, 2001, from heart failure at the age of 64. He'd spent his final years in relative comfort compared to his early life. Regular meals, climate control, access to television and cigarettes, guards who knew him by name. In a perverse way, prison had given Henry what freedom never could: stability, routine, and identity, and the knowledge that people paid attention when he spoke. His last words were reported as simple: "I done what I done." A confession that confessed nothing, perfectly on brand for a man who'd spent decades blurring the line between truth and performance. The autopsy was routine, unremarkable. Henry's brain showed damage consistent with childhood head trauma, the kind of injury that could explain impulse control problems and violent tendencies but couldn't excuse decades of manipulation and murder. His body was cremated, ashes scattered in a location nobody bothered recording. Henry Lee Lucas disappeared the way he'd lived, leaving questions instead of answers, confusion instead of clarity. In the decades since Henry's death, technology has provided some clarity. DNA evidence has exonerated him in several murders he confessed to, definitively proving his absence from crime scenes. It has also potentially connected him to murders he never confessed to. A few cold cases where forensic evidence suggests Henry might have actually been present, might have actually committed these crimes, but never bothered confessing because they didn't serve his purposes. The case of Tina Williams exemplifies this category. The 19-year-old vanished from Lubbock, Texas, in 1979. Her remains were found 2 years later in a shallow grave. Henry never confessed to killing Tina, but forensic evidence, primitive by modern standards but compelling, suggested his involvement. A necklace found near the remains matched jewelry Henry had possessed. Witness statements placed him in Lubbock during the relevant time frame. The disposal method mirrored the legitimate Lucas murders. Yet because Henry didn't confess to Tina's murder, perhaps he'd genuinely forgotten, perhaps it didn't fit his narrative, perhaps he was protecting someone. She remained officially unsolved even as evidence pointed toward him. How many Tina Williams cases exist? How many murders did Henry actually commit but never confess to because they were less dramatic than the false confessions, because they didn't give him the reaction he craved, because the truth was less interesting than his lies? The number will never be known with certainty. Estimates range from 3 confirmed murders to possibly 20 legitimate victims scattered across his years of drifting. Far fewer than the 600 he claimed, far more than most people wanted to believe after the confession scandal broke. The reckoning continues even now, decades after Henry's death. In 2019, when DNA technology finally identified orange socks as Deborah Jackson, her case was reopened with a focus on finding her real killer. Investigators discovered she'd had a boyfriend with a history of violence, multiple witnesses who saw them arguing shortly before her disappearance, evidence that Henry Lucas's confession had caused detectives to abandon promising leads in favor of easy closure. Deborah Jackson's real killer might never be found because Henry Lucas's lies gave him a 20-year head start. The Lucas legacy is written in unsolved murders, compromised investigations, and families who'll never know the truth about their loved ones' deaths. It's written in the textbooks teaching new investigators about confirmation bias, in the reformed interrogation protocols designed to prevent future Lucas situations, in the institutional skepticism that now greets serial killer confessions. Henry Lee Lucas forced American law enforcement to confront uncomfortable truths about its own vulnerabilities, its desperation for closure, its willingness to sacrifice truth for convictions. Was Henry Lee Lucas America's most prolific serial killer? Absolutely not. That title remains contested among genuinely horrific monsters like Gary Ridgway, Samuel Little, or Harold Shipman. Was he a serial killer at all? Yes, by any reasonable definition. He murdered at least 3 people, possibly more, demonstrating the pattern and psychological profile consistent with serial homicide. Was he the confession killer, a man who weaponized false admissions to expose systemic failure? Undeniably, yes. That might be his truest title, the identity that actually captures what made Henry Lee Lucas historically significant beyond his actual body count. The horror of Henry Lee Lucas isn't found in the murders he committed, terrible as those were. It's found in the realization that a barely literate drifter with obvious psychological problems manipulated the entire American criminal justice system, convincing trained investigators to believe obvious impossibilities, to close hundreds of cases without proper evidence, to value closure over truth. It's found in the knowledge that real killers escaped justice because resources were wasted processing Henry's lies. It's found in families still searching for answers because Henry Lucas turned their tragedies into entertainment. In the end, Henry Lee Lucas achieved a form of immortality more lasting than his actual crimes. He became a cautionary tale, a permanent reminder that the hunger for easy answers can blind even experienced investigators to obvious truths. Every unsolved murder carries a question now. Could this be another Lucas situation? Are we believing what we want to believe rather than what the evidence supports? That doubt, that institutional skepticism, might be Henry's most enduring legacy. A gift wrapped in tragedy, purchased with the blood of victims whose names we'll never know and justice that will never come. The story of Henry Lee Lucas ends not with resolution but with recognition. Monsters don't always look like monsters. Lies can be more dangerous than violence. And sometimes the scariest truth is that we're all capable of believing comfortable fictions rather than facing uncomfortable realities. Henry understood this about human nature better than most psychologists. He exploited it masterfully, and in doing so, he became exactly what he always claimed to be: unforgettable, significant, impossible to ignore, just not in the way anyone expected. The confession killer confessed to hundreds of murders. The real crime was that we believed him. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2, the Baldy Case. Some fathers protect their children from monsters. Joseph Baldy became one instead. We're diving into the mind of a predator who wore the mask of a devoted parent, a man who turned his own home into a hunting ground where innocence went to die. Joseph Baldy didn't just cross lines. He erased them, and what investigators found behind his carefully constructed facade would shatter every assumption about evil hiding in plain sight. The Baldy household existed like countless others across suburban America. White picket aspirations wrapped around dark wood interiors, a 2-story structure where neighbors waved and lawn mowers hummed on Saturday mornings. Joseph Baldy cultivated an image as meticulously as he tended his front yard. The hardworking father, the reliable neighbor, the man who fixed broken faucets and offered friendly advice over backyard fences. Nobody suspected that behind the pressed khakis and easy smile lived something fundamentally broken, something that had been waiting in the shadows of his psyche for the perfect opportunity to emerge. For years, Joseph moved through society like a ghost passing through walls. Unseen, undetected, unremarkable. He understood the language of normalcy fluently, spoke it with practiced ease at PTA meetings and neighborhood barbecues. His children grew up under his roof, their laughter echoing through hallways that would later reveal themselves as corridors of horror. The family attended church on Sundays, their faces scrubbed clean and innocent, Joseph's hand resting protectively on small shoulders in photographs that would eventually be examined by investigators searching for clues they'd missed. But darkness doesn't announce itself with thunderclaps and lightning strikes. It creeps in quietly, through incremental boundary violations and slowly escalating behaviors that remain invisible until someone finally pulls back the curtain. Joseph's depravity didn't explode into existence overnight. It grew like black mold behind walls, spreading its toxic spores through every corner of family life while maintaining a pristine exterior that fooled everyone who mattered. The first signs, subtle as whispers, went unnoticed or were rationalized away by those who encountered them. A daughter who grew increasingly withdrawn, her eyes carrying shadows too heavy for childhood. Bedroom doors that locked from the outside, explained away as safety measures. Excessive control disguised as protective parenting, isolation packaged as family bonding. Joseph orchestrated his crimes with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony, each movement calculated, each note of normalcy perfectly pitched to avoid suspicion. His wife, if she suspected anything, remained silent. Whether from fear, denial, or complicity would become a question that haunted investigators. The community saw what Joseph wanted them to see: a devoted family man who sacrificed for his children, who worked long hours to provide comfort and security. They didn't see the predator who returned home each evening to a domain where he wielded absolute power, where small voices learned that crying for help would go unanswered, where trust became the weapon used to destroy the very souls he was supposed to protect. Joseph's hunting ground wasn't some remote cabin in the woods or abandoned warehouse in a forgotten district. It was the dinner table where meals were shared, the living room where homework was completed, the bedrooms where nightmares became reality and reality twisted into something too terrible for young minds to process. He transformed sacred spaces into crime scenes, turned the sanctuary of home into a prison where escape existed only in damaged psyches that would spend lifetimes trying to heal. The psychological warfare he waged proved even more devastating than the physical violations. Joseph didn't just abuse bodies. He colonized minds, implanting lies that would take root and flourish into toxic beliefs about worthlessness, guilt, and shame. He convinced his victims that speaking out would destroy the family, that they were complicit in their own victimization, that nobody would believe them even if they found the courage to tell. This mental manipulation represented perhaps his most heinous crime, because it ensured his victims would carry his poison long after the physical abuse ended. Technology became both his tool and eventually his undoing. In an age where digital footprints never truly disappear, Joseph created an archive of his depravity, documenting his crimes with the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. Hard drives filled with evidence of systematic abuse, communications that revealed the calculated nature of his predation, search histories that painted a portrait of escalating obsession. All of it waiting to be discovered by investigators who would eventually connect the dots that concerned neighbors and teachers had tried to highlight for years. The carefully constructed facade began developing hairline fractures. A teacher noticed bruises that didn't match the explanation provided. A concerned relative asked uncomfortable questions that were met with hostile deflection. A victim found the courage to confide in a friend, planting seeds of revelation that would eventually blossom into full exposure. Joseph felt the walls beginning to close in, but his narcissism wouldn't allow him to believe that his carefully built empire of abuse could actually crumble. He'd gotten away with it for so long, convinced himself that his intelligence and careful planning made him bulletproof. But predators always make mistakes eventually. Their arrogance becomes their weakness. Their confidence transforms into carelessness. Joseph began taking greater risks, his behavior growing bolder as the thrill of violation required increasingly dangerous scenarios to satisfy whatever sick compulsion drove him. He started leaving evidence in places where it could be found. His control began slipping as victims grew older, stronger, more aware that what was happening to them wasn't normal or acceptable. The monster hiding behind Joseph Baldy's pleasant mask was preparing for exposure, though he didn't realize it yet. Every crime he committed added another brick to the prison that would eventually house him. Every violation created another witness who would testify to his evil. Every moment he spent destroying innocence brought him one step closer to the reckoning that survivors of his abuse had dreamed about in their darkest hours. The suburban neighborhood where the Baldy family lived would soon learn that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs and red flags. Sometimes it moves in next door, waves hello, borrows your tools, and commits atrocities behind closed doors while maintaining a perfect disguise. The revelation of Joseph Baldy's crimes would shatter the community's sense of safety, forcing everyone to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like the person you trust to watch your children. The call came into the police department on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day where officers expected routine traffic stops and minor disturbances, not a case that would expose one of the most disturbing patterns of familial abuse in the jurisdiction's history. A school counselor, voice trembling with barely contained emotion, reported concerns about a student who had finally broken down and revealed years of systematic sexual abuse at home. The name Joseph Baldy meant nothing to the detective who took the initial report, but within hours, it would become synonymous with a depravity that shocked even seasoned investigators who thought they'd seen everything. Detective Sarah Morrison drew the assignment, a 17-year veteran of the sex crimes unit whose steady demeanor masked the emotional toll her work extracted. She'd interviewed hundreds of abuse victims, built dozens of cases against predators who thought themselves clever, but something about this case immediately struck her as different. The victim's statement, haltingly delivered through tears and panic attacks, revealed not just isolated incidents of abuse, but a systematic pattern of grooming, manipulation, and escalating sexual violence that had persisted for years under the guise of normal family life. The initial interview took place in a specially designed room meant to minimize trauma, soft lighting and comfortable furniture attempting to create safety where none truly existed when discussing such horror. The victim, who we'll protect by not naming, spoke in fragments, disjointed memories that trauma had shattered into sharp pieces that cut even in the retelling. Joseph had started with inappropriate touches disguised as affection, progressed to violations justified as education, and eventually abandoned all pretense as his control became absolute and his victim's resistance crumbled under sustained psychological warfare. Morrison recognized the hallmarks of a sophisticated predator immediately. Joseph hadn't simply acted on impulse. He'd crafted a careful campaign of grooming that isolated his victim, normalized increasingly inappropriate behavior, and created conditions where disclosure seemed impossible. He'd threatened that speaking out would destroy the family. He'd convinced his victim that the abuse was somehow deserved, earned through disobedience or provoked by behavior. He'd alternated between violence and affection, creating traumatic bonding that made the victim desperate for approval, even while being destroyed by the same person providing occasional kindness. The detective knew that one victim's testimony, while powerful, would face challenges in court. Defense attorneys would attack credibility, suggest alternative explanations, exploit any inconsistencies in statements made by someone whose trauma had fragmented memory. Morrison needed corroboration, physical evidence, digital footprints, anything that could transform disturbing allegations into an airtight case that would see Joseph Baldy behind bars for the rest of his natural life. The search warrant execution happened at dawn, tactical teams surrounding the Baldy residence while Joseph slept, unaware that his secret life was about to become public record. Officers flooded through the front door with weapons drawn, treating the scene as high risk because men who abuse family members often prove dangerous when cornered. Joseph emerged from the master bedroom confused and indignant, demanding explanations while maintaining the outraged innocence of the falsely accused. His performance was Oscar-worthy shock, hurt, bewildered confusion at what he insisted were malicious lies from a troubled child seeking attention. But his protestations meant nothing to investigators who'd heard identical speeches from dozens of predators before him. Morrison watched Joseph's micro-expressions, noting the calculation behind his emotional display, the way his eyes moved constantly, as if searching for escape routes or planning his next move. This was no confused innocent. This was a predator caught in the act, scrambling to activate whatever defense mechanisms he'd prepared for this eventuality. The digital forensics team went to work immediately, seizing computers, tablets, phones, external hard drives, and any device capable of storing data. In the modern age, predators often document their own crimes, unable to resist the impulse to collect trophies or too arrogant to believe they'll ever be caught. Joseph Baldi proved no exception. His laptop contained thousands of images that would later be used as evidence. Photographs he'd taken over years of abuse, searches for child exploitation material, communications with like-minded predators in dark corners of the internet where monsters gathered to share techniques and validate each other's perversions. The bedroom where much of the abuse occurred told its own story to trained investigators. Locks on the outside of doors, cameras positioned to monitor a victim's movements, evidence of physical restraints inadequately hidden in closets. Each detail painting a picture of imprisonment disguised as family life. Morrison photographed everything, knowing that juries would need to see the environment where these crimes occurred, understanding that visual evidence could communicate horror more effectively than any testimony. As the investigation deepened, more victims emerged from the shadows. A cousin who'd been victimized during family gatherings. A neighborhood child who'd been lured into the Baldi home with promises of video games and snacks, only to experience violations that trauma had locked away until this investigation created space for disclosure. Each new victim added years to the potential sentence Joseph faced, but more importantly, each statement corroborated patterns of behavior that demolished his claims of innocence. The forensic analysis of Joseph's devices revealed communications that chilled investigators to their core. He'd connected with other predators online, exchanged strategies for grooming victims and avoiding detection, shared images and videos documenting his crimes. The digital evidence painted a portrait of a man wholly consumed by sexual obsession with children, someone who'd structured his entire life around facilitating abuse while maintaining the appearance of respectability. Prosecutors began building a case designed to ensure Joseph Baldi would never walk free again. They compiled victim statements, digital evidence, physical proof, expert testimony about grooming behaviors and the psychology of familial abuse. Every element was carefully organized, every potential defense preemptively addressed, every weakness in the case identified and strengthened. This wouldn't be a trial where reasonable doubt could take root. This would be an avalanche of evidence that would bury Joseph under the weight of his own evil. Joseph, meanwhile, cycled through the predictable stages of a caught predator. Initial denial gave way to minimization. Yes, there'd been inappropriate contact, but it wasn't really abuse, just poor judgment and misunderstanding. When that failed to gain traction, he attempted to shift blame onto his victims, suggesting they'd been seductive or willing participants. Each defense proved more pathetic than the last, transparent attempts to avoid accountability that only reinforced his depravity in the eyes of investigators. Behind bars awaiting trial, Joseph's mask finally slipped completely. Guards reported volatile mood swings, grandiose statements about his intelligence being too sophisticated for the legal system to comprehend, and disturbing attempts to manipulate fellow inmates with the same techniques he'd used on his victims. The monster no longer needed to hide because the cage was now visible to everyone. No more pretending to be a good father or upstanding citizen, just raw malevolence stripped of its disguise. Morrison knew the trial would devastate the victims who'd need to testify, forcing them to relive trauma in a public forum while defense attorneys worked to discredit their pain. But she also knew that justice required this painful process, that allowing Joseph to plead guilty to reduce charges would feel like another betrayal to survivors who deserved validation. The case would proceed to trial, where a jury of peers would decide whether Joseph Baldi was a monster or, as he maintained, simply misunderstood. The investigation had exposed evil festering in the heart of suburban normalcy, reminded a community that predators rarely look like the villains in horror movies. They look like neighbors and family men, coaches and volunteers, people we trust because their masks are so convincing. Joseph Baldi had fooled everyone for years, but the investigation was finally allowing truth to emerge from beneath layers of lies and manipulation. The courtroom filled with spectators long before proceedings began, a crowd drawn by the grotesque fascination humans harbor for darkness, hiding with an apparent normalcy. Joseph Baldi entered in shackles, his prison-issued jumpsuit a stark contrast to the respectable clothing he'd worn during years of undetected predation. His expression carried carefully crafted remorse, another performance for an audience he hoped to manipulate into sympathy or at least reasonable doubt. But the evidence stacked against him created a mountain no amount of acting could move. The prosecution opened with a statement designed to inoculate the jury against the defense's anticipated strategy of victim blaming and obfuscation. They outlined Joseph's systematic grooming behaviors, his escalating pattern of abuse, the digital evidence demonstrating calculated predation rather than impulsive mistakes. The prosecutor's voice remained steady but forceful, painting a portrait of a predator who'd weaponized trust and exploited vulnerability while hiding behind the facade of fatherhood. Every word was chosen to communicate not just facts but the profound betrayal these crimes represented. Joseph's defense attorney faced an impossible task: how to defend the indefensible without appearing to endorse abuse while still providing constitutionally mandated representation. He settled on attacking the reliability of victim testimony, suggesting that memories could be implanted or distorted, that misunderstandings about appropriate parental affection had been transformed into abuse allegations by outside influences with agendas. It was a desperate strategy that would ultimately fail, but desperate strategies were all that remained when evidence overwhelmed any claim of innocence. The first victim to testify approached the witness stand with visible terror, hands shaking as they placed one palm on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor guided them through testimony gently, establishing the relationship with Joseph, the early grooming behaviors, the escalation into overt sexual abuse. Every answer came wrapped in pain, words forcing themselves past trauma that wanted to keep secrets buried. The courtroom listened in horrified silence as childhood was described in terms no child should ever have to use: violation, manipulation, fear, shame. Defense cross-examination attempted to poke holes in the timeline, suggested inconsistencies in statements made months apart, implied that the victim sought attention or held grudges that motivated false accusations. But juries have evolved in their understanding of trauma and memory, recognizing that inconsistencies often validate rather than discredit testimony because traumatized brains don't record experiences in neat, linear narratives. The victim remained composed despite aggressive questioning, refusing to let Joseph's attorney recreate the power dynamic that had defined years of abuse. Joseph watched the testimony with manufactured sadness, occasionally shaking his head or wiping away crocodile tears designed to suggest that misunderstanding rather than malevolence explained the accusations. But his performance convinced nobody. The jury studied him with expressions mixing disgust and cold fury, seeing through calculated emotion to the predator beneath. Every tactical tear only deepened their revulsion. Every head shake reinforced their certainty that this man represented genuine evil. Additional victims took the stand in succession, each testimony reinforcing patterns that demolished any claim of isolated mistakes or misunderstandings. The second victim, a cousin, described being groomed during family gatherings, Joseph creating opportunities for alone time under pretenses that adults accepted without question. The third victim, a neighborhood child, recounted promises of friendship that transformed into violations that shattered their innocence and trust in humanity. Each statement added weight to the prosecution's case, creating a tapestry of abuse so extensive that reasonable doubt became impossible. Forensic psychologist Dr. Rebecca Thornton provided expert testimony explaining grooming behaviors and the psychology of familial abuse. She walked the jury through the stages of predation Joseph had employed: target selection, trust development, isolation, gradual boundary violation, maintenance of secrecy, and entrenchment of abuse. Her clinical language gave framework to testimony that might otherwise seem too horrific to believe, helping jurors understand that Joseph's behavior fit established patterns of sophisticated predators who operate within family systems. The digital evidence presentation proved devastating to any remaining defense credibility. Forensic analysts took the jury through Joseph's computer history, displaying search terms that revealed obsession with child exploitation material, communications with other predators discussing techniques, and thousands of images documenting his crimes. The defense could offer no innocent explanation for why a father would maintain such archives. Couldn't explain away conversations where Joseph bragged about his access to victims and discussed strategies for avoiding detection. Joseph's daughter, the victim whose disclosure initiated the investigation, provided the most powerful testimony. She'd grown stronger since first speaking to Detective Morrison, therapy helping her understand that shame belonged with the perpetrator, not the victim. She spoke directly to the jury, describing how Joseph had transformed her childhood into a waking nightmare, stolen her sense of safety and self-worth, forced her to carry secrets that poisoned her spirit. Then she turned to face Joseph directly, declaring that she refused to let him hide anymore, that she was reclaiming her voice and her life despite everything he'd done to silence and control her. The courtroom sat in absolute silence during her statement, many spectators openly weeping as they absorbed the courage required for a survivor to confront their abuser in open court. Joseph looked away, unable to maintain eye contact with the daughter he'd victimized for years. His lawyer objected weakly to the victim impact statement's timing, but the judge overruled, recognizing that justice required allowing survivors to be heard on their own terms. The defense called no witnesses, Joseph himself declining to testify despite his attorney's likely recommendation. Taking the stand would expose him to cross-examination where prosecutors could systematically destroy every lie he told over years of predation. His silence spoke volumes. Guilty men rarely risk facing questions they can't answer with rehearsed deception. The defense rested after a brief closing argument that even the attorney delivering it seemed to recognize as futile, going through motions required by professional obligation while knowing the outcome was predetermined by overwhelming evidence. Prosecutorial closing arguments hammered home the systematic nature of Joseph's crimes, the calculated destruction of multiple young lives, the profound betrayal of trust that made familial abuse particularly devastating. The prosecutor reminded jurors that reasonable doubt didn't mean any doubt. It meant doubt based on reason and evidence, not sympathy or wishful thinking. The evidence against Joseph eliminated reasonable doubt, leaving only the certainty that a predator sat before them wearing the skin of a human being but lacking any humanity beneath the surface. Jury deliberation lasted less than 4 hours, a remarkably short time for a case of this complexity, suggesting that unanimous agreement came easily once jurors reviewed evidence in private. When they returned, the foreperson stood and delivered guilty verdicts on every count: multiple charges of child sexual abuse, possession and creation of child exploitation material, endangering the welfare of minors. Joseph's face remained impassive as his convictions were read, still performing composure even as his life as a free man ended permanently. Sentencing came weeks later, after victim impact statements from survivors and their families painted a fuller picture of destruction Joseph had wrought. The judge, a 20-year veteran known for measured rulings, abandoned any pretense of judicial neutrality in denouncing Joseph's crimes. He spoke about the special circle of hell reserved for those who violate children, particularly those who exploit positions of trust and authority to facilitate abuse. Then he handed down consecutive sentences totaling over a century behind bars, ensuring that Joseph Baldi would die in prison, never again having access to potential victims. Joseph was led from the courtroom in chains, his carefully maintained facade finally crumbling into the reality of permanent imprisonment. Survivors embraced outside the courthouse, tears mixing relief with grief for childhoods that could never be restored. Justice had been served in the legal sense, but the emotional justice, the healing and recovery from profound trauma, would require years of work that extended far beyond any courtroom verdict. The prison gates closed behind Joseph Baldi with the finality of a tomb ceiling, concrete and steel creating a barrier between a predator and society he'd terrorized. He entered the correction system as a convicted child predator, a designation ensuring his incarceration would bring its own punishments beyond mere confinement. Prison society enforces its own brutal hierarchy, and those who victimize children occupy the lowest rung, targeted by inmates eager to demonstrate moral superiority through violence against the universally reviled. Joseph's first weeks inside proved harsh orientation into consequences. Other prisoners recognized him from news coverage, his crimes discussed in graphic detail by media outlets that found public fascination with monsters irresistible. He faced threats, attacks, isolation that forced protective custody placement. The man who'd wielded absolute power over helpless victims now cowered in a cell, dependent on guards for basic safety, experiencing the vulnerability and fear he'd inflicted on others. There was poetic justice in his powerlessness, though no punishment could truly balance the scales of trauma he'd created. For his victims, the verdict brought complicated emotions rather than simple relief. Justice in courtrooms doesn't heal psychological wounds or restore stolen innocence. Therapy became their primary battleground, sessions where they confronted internalized shame, worked to rebuild fractured self-concepts, learned that they were survivors rather than victims defined permanently by abuse. The road to recovery stretched long and uncertain, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs, good days and crushing flashbacks that transported them back to moments they wished to forget forever. The Baldi family fractured under the weight of revelation. Joseph's wife faced her own reckoning. How much had she known, suspected, or willfully ignored? The community judgment proved harsh, many assuming her complicity even without evidence. She maintained she'd been deceived like everyone else, but trust once shattered rarely fully repairs. Her relationship with her children became strained under the weight of questions about why she hadn't protected them, why warning signs went unaddressed, why Joseph's access to victims remained unlimited despite behavioral red flags. The neighborhood where the Baldis lived struggled to process that a predator had operated undetected in their midst for years. Parents questioned their own judgment, wondering what they'd missed and whether their own children had been targeted. Property values declined as the Baldi house became infamous, a physical reminder of evil that had bloomed behind suburban respectability. Eventually, someone bought the property at a discount, demolished the structure, and built something new on ground that couldn't quite shed its dark history. Schools implemented enhanced training for teachers and counselors on recognizing signs of abuse and creating environments where children felt safe disclosing. The Baldi case became a teaching example, not in exploitative ways that traumatized survivors further, but as a reminder that predators rarely announce themselves obviously, that grooming behaviors often masquerade as appropriate care, that children need adults brave enough to ask difficult questions and act on uncomfortable answers. Law enforcement agencies examined the case for systemic lessons about detection and prevention. Several concerning reports had reached authorities years before the investigation that ultimately exposed Joseph's crimes, but they'd been inadequately followed up or dismissed as misunderstandings. The department implemented new protocols for investigating familial abuse allegations, recognizing that children's initial denials often stem from fear rather than truth, that predators within families enjoy unique advantages in maintaining silence and control. Detective Morrison, whose work had been instrumental in building the case, continued handling sex crimes investigations but carried the weight of each case personally. She'd spoken with Joseph during one interview after his arrest, attempting to understand what motivated such systematic destruction of innocence. He'd offered only justifications and minimizations, never genuine insight into whatever darkness consumed him. She concluded that some evil defies understanding, that searching for explanations sometimes proves less important than ensuring justice and supporting survivors. Advocacy organizations used the Baldi case to push for legislative reforms strengthening penalties for child sexual abuse and improving resources for survivors. They highlighted how Joseph's crimes persisted partly because systems failed to protect vulnerable children despite multiple opportunities for intervention. New laws emerged focused on mandatory reporting requirements, funding for forensic interview centers, and enhanced training for professionals who interact with children regularly. Joseph himself settled into prison routine, though reports suggested he remained manipulative and predatory even in confinement. Guards documented attempts to groom younger inmates, efforts to access positions that might give him contact with visitors or civilian staff. His behavior confirmed what investigators had concluded. He was fundamentally unchanged by consequences, motivated by compulsions that punishment couldn't rehabilitate. The only effective intervention was permanent separation from potential victims through incarceration that would last until death. The survivors moved forward with varying degrees of success. Some found paths toward healing and built lives not defined by trauma. Others struggled with addiction, mental health crises, relationship difficulties that stemmed from fundamental damage to their ability to trust and connect. All carried scars, though some learned to view those scars as evidence of survival rather than marks of permanent brokenness. Their healing journeys continued long after the criminal justice process concluded. Personal battles fought in therapy offices and midnight hours when memories invaded sleep. Years passed. Joseph aged in his cell, health declining as consequences of incarceration accumulated. He never expressed genuine remorse, never acknowledged the full scope of his crimes without couching them in justifications and excuses. The narcissism that enabled his predation prevented the self-reflection necessary for actual accountability. He wrote letters claiming innocence or minimizing his actions, seeking pen pals or legal assistance for appeals that courts routinely rejected as frivolous. His victims lived their lives as completely as possible despite carrying burdens they never chose. Some became advocates themselves, speaking publicly about abuse and survival when they felt strong enough to do so. Others chose privacy, healing privately without obligation to educate or inspire through their trauma. Both paths remained valid. Survival looks different for everyone, and no one owed the world their story or their pain. The case became a case study in criminology courses, psychology seminars, and law enforcement training programs. Joseph Baldy's name joined the grim catalog of domestic predators whose crimes shocked communities and exposed the reality that danger often lurks closest to home rather than in stereotypical stranger scenarios. His case reminded professionals and parents alike that vigilance matters, that children need adults willing to see truth even when it's uncomfortable, that protection requires action rather than assumptions. The final lesson from the Baldy case proved simple yet profound. Evil wears ordinary faces, hides behind ordinary lives, and operates most effectively when people convince themselves that monsters only exist in distant places rather than next door, at family gatherings, in positions of trusted authority. Exposing that evil requires courage from victims willing to speak despite fear, dedication from investigators refusing to overlook hard truths, and commitment from communities to believe, protect, and support those who come forward with disclosures that shatter comfortable illusions about safety and normalcy. Joseph Baldy will die in prison, forgotten by most except those whose lives he damaged irreparably. His legacy isn't the fear he inspired or the trauma he created. It's the courage of survivors who refused to let him keep them silent, who transformed victimization into testimony, who ensured that at least one predator faced consequences. Their strength echoes louder than his evil, their recovery more meaningful than his punishment, their lives moving forward while his remains frozen in the cage he built through his own choices. The story doesn't end with justice served, but continues in therapy sessions, support groups, quiet moments of reclaimed peace, and hard-won victories over trauma that tried to define destinies. The hunt for the monster concluded when he was caged, but the hunt for healing continues day by day, carried forward by survivors who refuse to let darkness have the final word. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our third story. Story 3. The Clark Perry Baldwin Case. Some predators wear masks. Others hide behind smiles and marriage vows. What happens when the man sworn to protect becomes the one you should fear most? We're tracking a killer who walked among us as a husband, a father, a neighbor, someone you'd wave to in the grocery store parking lot. But behind closed doors, Clark Perry Baldwin was engineering nightmares, orchestrating disappearances that would haunt 3 families forever. The twisted part? He almost got away with it. He should have gotten away with it. And that's what makes this story absolutely terrifying. Spring 1991, Waterloo, Iowa. A quiet Midwestern city where everyone knows their neighbors, where front doors stay unlocked, where trust is currency. But something sinister is already moving through these streets, selecting victims with calculated precision. March 21st arrives like any ordinary Thursday. 17-year-old Sean Brown is living the typical existence of a small-town teenager. School, friends, dreams of what comes next. She's got her whole life ahead of her, plans that extend beyond the cornfields and railroad tracks of Iowa. That evening, she tells her family she's heading out. It's a decision that will echo through decades. She never comes home. Her disappearance doesn't immediately trigger alarm bells. Teenagers run away. They rebel. They make impulsive choices. The initial response is measured, almost casual. Give it a few days. She'll turn up. But those days stretch into weeks, and weeks collapse into months. Sean Brown has simply evaporated, as if the earth opened up and swallowed her whole. The community's unease settles like fog over Waterloo, but life continues. It has to. People can't live in constant fear. They convince themselves it was an isolated incident, a tragic anomaly. Sean must have run away to a bigger city, chasing dreams or escaping troubles nobody knew about. They're wrong. For months later, summer heat blankets Iowa in oppressive humidity. July 17th, 1991. 18-year-old Catherine Dyer is navigating her own path through young adulthood. She's got ambitions, relationships, a future she's actively building. That Wednesday, she goes about her routine, completely unaware that a predator has already marked her. Catherine disappears. The similarities are impossible to ignore now. Two teenage girls, both from Waterloo, both vanishing without a trace within months of each other. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence, just empty spaces where vibrant young women used to be. The fear that was simmering now reaches a boil. Parents grip their children tighter. Girls are warned not to go anywhere alone. The community transforms, suspicion replacing trust. Law enforcement launches investigations, but they're working blind. In 1991, surveillance cameras aren't on every corner. Cell phones aren't tracking everyone's movements. Social media doesn't exist to create digital breadcrumbs. When someone disappears, they simply disappear. The detectives conduct interviews, chase leads that go nowhere, and watch their case files grow cold. What nobody knows, what nobody could possibly know, is that the answer to this mystery is hiding in plain sight, wearing a wedding ring and coaching Little League. The years drag forward. 1992 becomes 1993 becomes 1994. Sean and Catherine's families refuse to give up hope, but hope becomes a heavier burden with each passing year. The case files get buried under newer crimes, fresher leads. Waterloo tries to move on, though the shadow of those disappearances never quite lifts. Then, April 1992, just 1 year after Sean Brown vanished, another family in a different state faces their own nightmare. Wyoming, Missouri sits roughly 400 miles south of Waterloo. It's even smaller, even quieter, the kind of place where a missing person case is almost unheard of. 15-year-old Angela Hammond is using a payphone outside a convenience store on April 4th, talking to her boyfriend, Rob Schaefer. It's late evening, around 11:45 p.m. During their conversation, Angela notices a pickup truck circling the area. Once, twice, 3 times. It's strange enough that she mentions it to Rob. The truck parks on the other side of the lot. A man gets out. Angela describes him briefly, clean-cut, not threatening in appearance. Then her voice changes. Fear floods through the phone line. I have to go. This man is coming toward me. Rob hears the payphone drop. He hears Angela scream, a sound that will haunt him for the rest of his life. He hears a man's voice, aggressive and commanding. Then the line goes dead. Rob doesn't waste a second. He's already in his car, racing toward the convenience store, pushing his vehicle to its limits. He makes it there in under 3 minutes, an impossibly fast response time. As he approaches, he sees taillights disappearing into the distance. Pickup truck speeding away. Rob pursues. His car is faster. He's gaining ground, getting closer, close enough to almost make out the license plate. Then catastrophe strikes, his transmission fails. His car sputters, loses power, becomes useless metal on the side of the road. He watches helplessly as the taillights vanish into the darkness, taking Angela with them. The Missouri authorities respond immediately. Within hours, a massive search operation launches. The FBI gets involved. America's Most Wanted features the case. Witnesses come forward describing a pickup truck, describing a man who matches a certain description. But despite the rapid response, despite the resources poured into finding her, Angela Hammond vanishes as completely as Sean Brown and Catherine Dyer. 3 young women, 3 separate disappearances, 3 families destroyed by uncertainty and grief. What connects them? Geography offers a clue. All 3 cases cluster in America's heartland, spread across Iowa and Missouri, but the connections run deeper than maps can show. These weren't random acts of violence. These weren't crimes of opportunity. Someone was hunting. The investigations continue, but without bodies, without witnesses, without evidence, they stall. The 3 cases remain open, filed under missing persons rather than homicides, though everyone involved understands the grim reality. Nobody disappears like this and comes home alive. Years pass, then decades. The families never stop searching. They form support groups, maintain websites, keep their daughters' names alive in public consciousness. They pressure law enforcement to keep investigating, to never close the files, to never give up. Some dedicate their entire lives to finding answers, sacrificing careers and relationships to the singular pursuit of truth. Meanwhile, in Waterloo, Iowa, a man named Clark Perry Baldwin is living what appears to be a completely normal existence. He's married. He has children. He works, pays his bills, attends community events. His neighbors describe him as quiet, unremarkable, perhaps a bit awkward, but certainly not dangerous. He's the kind of person who blends seamlessly into the background of American suburban life. Nobody suspects him of anything. Nobody connects him to the missing girls. Nobody realizes they're living next to a monster who's mastered the art of camouflage, who's hidden his true nature so effectively that even those closest to him have no idea what he's capable of. But secrets have a weight. They press down, accumulate pressure, and eventually something has to give. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a tendency to surface. Sometimes it takes a year. Sometimes it takes 3 decades. For the families of Sean Brown, Catherine Dyer, and Angela Hammond, that truth was still waiting, buried somewhere between evidence lockers and fading memories, between cold case files and a killer's conscience. The clock was ticking, though nobody knew it yet. Justice was coming, but it would take a circuitous route through DNA databases, through forensic advances that didn't exist in 1991, through the dogged determination of investigators who refused to let these cases die. Clark Perry Baldwin had been free for decades, walking around as if he hadn't destroyed multiple families, as if he hadn't stolen 3 futures. But his time was running out. The hunt was about to begin. Clark Perry Baldwin understood something fundamental about human nature. People see what they expect to see. Present yourself as normal, as boring, as utterly unremarkable, and you become invisible. It's the perfect disguise, requiring no costume, no elaborate lies, just the mundane performance of everyday life. Born in 1962, Baldwin grew up in the Midwest, that vast stretch of American normalcy where extremes are discouraged and fitting in is a survival skill. His childhood appears, on surface examination, unremarkable. No obvious red flags, no documented abuse, no incidents that would predict what he'd become. But then again, monsters aren't always made by circumstance. Sometimes they simply are. By 1991, Baldwin is approaching 30 years old. He's married, establishing himself in the community, crafting the persona that will shield him for decades. He's not handsome enough to stand out, not ugly enough to be remembered. His features are average, the kind of face that disappears in a crowd, that witnesses struggle to describe even minutes after seeing it. This mediocrity is his superpower. When Sean Brown crosses his path in March 1991, she has no reason to be afraid. Whatever approach he uses, and we may never know the exact methodology, it doesn't trigger alarm. Maybe he asks for directions. Maybe he offers assistance. Maybe he simply waits for the perfect moment when vulnerability and opportunity intersect. Predators are patient. They study patterns, identify weaknesses, strike when circumstances align. Sean disappears, and Baldwin returns to his life. He kisses his wife. He goes to work. He maintains absolute normalcy. There's no suspicious behavior, no sudden changes in routine that might draw attention. He's calculated enough to understand that deviation from the norm creates curiosity, and curiosity invites investigation. For months later, he does it again with Catherine Dyer. The question that haunts investigators and psychologists alike: how does someone compartmentalize this level of evil? How do you murder, and we must call it what it is even without recovered bodies, and then sit down to dinner with your family? How do you live a double life so completely that not even those sleeping in the same house suspect the truth? The answer lies in the psychology of the psychopath, though that term gets thrown around so carelessly that it's lost some meaning. True psychopathy isn't about wild-eyed violence or obvious instability. It's about an absence. Specifically, an absence of empathy, of conscience, of the internal mechanisms that make most people recoil from causing harm. Baldwin doesn't feel guilt because he's neurologically incapable of it. His victims aren't people to him. They're objects, toys to be used and discarded. This fundamental difference in wiring explains how he functions. While his neighbors are losing sleep worrying about the missing girls, Baldwin sleeps just fine. While Waterloo transforms into a community gripped by fear, Baldwin walks those same streets without a racing heartbeat or sweating palms. He's not pretending to be calm. He actually is calm because he feels nothing. The Angela Hammond abduction in Missouri presents interesting questions about Baldwin's methodology and range. Wyoming. Missouri is roughly a 400-mile drive from Waterloo. Manageable in a day, but suggesting either that Baldwin was willing to travel for his hunts, or that he had reasons to be in the area. Did he deliberately expand his hunting grounds to avoid establishing a pattern? Was he in Missouri for legitimate reasons when opportunity presented itself? We know from Rob Schaefer's testimony that the abductor drove a pickup truck, and that he was described as clean-cut and non-threatening in appearance. We know the abduction was bold, snatching someone from a public parking lot while she was actively on the phone. This suggests confidence, a belief in his own ability to avoid capture. Baldwin possesses that confidence in abundance. Back in Waterloo, he continues his performance. He's involved enough in community affairs to seem normal, but not so involved that he attracts attention. He maintains employment, though nothing particularly noteworthy. Jobs that allow him to blend in, that don't require close scrutiny or extensive background checks. He's smart enough to avoid law enforcement careers or positions that might subject him to psychological evaluations. His marriage continues, though one wonders what his wife sees when she looks at him. Does she notice anything off? Any unexplained absences? Any moments when the mask slips and something darker peeks through? Or has he perfected the performance so completely that even intimate proximity reveals nothing? The children growing up in Baldwin's household face a particular horror, not of recognition, but of ignorance. They're being raised by a killer, sleeping under the same roof as someone who's ended multiple lives, and they have no idea. This speaks to Baldwin's control, his ability to separate his crimes from his domestic life so thoroughly that no contamination occurs. Years accumulate. The 1990s give way to the 2000s. Technology evolves. The world becomes more connected, more surveilled, harder to hide in. But Baldwin's crimes predate this evolution. He committed his murders in that window of time before DNA databases, before ubiquitous cameras, before digital footprints made anonymity nearly impossible. He's locked in a strange state of temporal immunity. His crimes exist in the past, shielded by the limitations of 1990s investigative techniques, while he exists in the present, benefiting from the passage of time that cools trails and dims memories. But he's also trapped. He can't flee without creating suspicion. He can't drastically change his life without inviting questions. He's committed to maintaining the facade, year after year, decade after decade. It's a prison of his own creation, built from lies and normalcy. Does he think about his victims? Probably not in the way normal people think about the dead. They're not people to him, not then and not now. They're memories, perhaps moments of power, of control, of fulfillment of whatever sick urges drive him. But they're not humans with families and futures and value. They never were. The families, meanwhile, never stop looking. They age, their other children grow up. Life forces them forward even as part of them remains frozen in 1991 and 1992. They create foundations. They petition lawmakers for better resources for cold cases. They keep their daughters' faces in public view, refusing to let them be forgotten. They have no idea they're probably driving past their daughter's killer in traffic, shopping in the same stores, existing in the same community spaces. Baldwin watches it all with whatever passes for emotion in his neural architecture. Does he feel satisfaction at having evaded justice? Does he experience contempt for the investigators who can't catch him? Or does he feel nothing at all, viewing the entire situation with the detached interest of someone watching a documentary about strangers? His children grow up. Some of them move away, starting their own lives, carrying their last name into the world without knowing it's been tainted by unspeakable acts. His wife ages alongside him, sharing his bed, his meals, his day-to-day existence, completely unaware she's married to evil. The community changes around him. Waterloo evolves. New families move in. Old families move away. The missing girls cases gradually shift from active community trauma to historical tragedy, the kind of thing mentioned occasionally, usually in the context of remember when conversations among longtime residents. Baldwin is counting on time to complete his escape. Every year that passes, evidence degrades. Witnesses' memories fade. Files get archived, then forgotten. He just needs to wait long enough, stay quiet enough, remain invisible enough. What he doesn't account for is the revolution happening in forensic science. DNA technology is advancing at an exponential rate. What was impossible in 1991 becomes possible in 2001, becomes routine by 2011. Genetic genealogy, the use of consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through family connections, emerges as a game-changing investigative tool. Suddenly, cold cases that seemed permanently frozen are thawing. The investigators working Sean, Catherine, and Angela's cases never gave up. They preserved evidence even when that evidence seemed useless. They maintained files, updated them with new information, refused to let these cases die through neglect. And slowly, piece by piece, the technology catches up to the crime. Baldwin doesn't see it coming. How could he? He's insulated by decades of safety, by the comfortable knowledge that he's gotten away with it. He's middle-aged now, settling into his 50s, then his 60s. Retirement approaches. He's made it. He's won. Except he hasn't. The past is reaching forward, and it's about to grab him by the throat. The breakthrough doesn't announce itself with sirens or dramatic music. It arrives quietly, emerging from the methodical work of investigators who refuse to accept defeat. In law enforcement, cold cases are heartbreaking, not just because they represent unsolved crimes, but because they represent failures, families still waiting, killers still free. But technology has become the equalizer. DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes in the early 1990s, evidence that was essentially useless at the time, suddenly holds potential. The science has evolved. What once required large samples now works with microscopic traces. What once could only exclude suspects can now identify them with near certainty. The investigators begin the painstaking process of re-examining every piece of physical evidence from all three cases. This tedious work, requiring patience and attention to detail that would break most people. Every item must be cataloged, tested, retested. Every result must be documented, verified, submitted for peer review. Somewhere in this mountain of evidence, they find it, biological material that doesn't belong to the victims. It's not much, just a trace, but it's enough. The DNA is extracted, amplified, and processed. The genetic profile goes into databases, searching for matches. Initially, there's nothing. The killer isn't in the criminal database, which suggests he's never been arrested for anything serious enough to require DNA collection. This is both surprising and not. Many killers escalate from smaller crimes, but some burst fully formed into major violence without prior legal entanglements. But the investigators have another tool: genetic genealogy. Consumer DNA testing has exploded in popularity. Millions of people have submitted their genetic material to services like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and others, hoping to learn about their ethnic heritage or connect with distant relatives. What most don't realize is they're also potentially solving cold cases. When you submit your DNA, you're not just revealing information about yourself, you're revealing information about everyone you're related to. Your genetic profile connects to your parents, your siblings, your cousins, your grandparents. It creates a web of familial relationships that can be traced and mapped. Investigators can use this web to work backwards. If they have the killer's DNA but he's not in the database, they search for people who share significant genetic markers with him, his relatives. Then they build family trees, identifying common ancestors, tracing bloodlines forward through generations until they narrow down to potential suspects. It's like genealogy in reverse, and it's revolutionizing cold case investigations. The DNA from the Baldwin cases goes through this process. Genetic genealogists identify distant relatives, then closer ones. They build family trees, cross-reference with public records, eliminate possibilities. The list of potential suspects grows, then shrinks further. And then a name emerges: Clark Perry Baldwin. He's the right age. He lived in Waterloo during the relevant time period. He matches physical descriptions provided by witnesses in the Angela Hammond case. He has no alibi for any of the relevant dates. But then again, who remembers where they were on a random Tuesday 3 decades ago? The investigators don't announce their findings. They can't, not yet. They need more than genealogical probability. They need confirmatory DNA directly from Baldwin himself. But how do you get a suspect's DNA without alerting him that he's under investigation? Surveillance begins. Baldwin, now in his late 50s, has no idea he's being watched. Retired or semi-retired, he goes about his daily routine, grocery shopping, running errands, maybe meeting friends for coffee. He's lived free for so long that the concept of being caught probably doesn't even occur to him anymore. The surveillance team follows him, documenting his movements, looking for an opportunity to collect what's called abandoned DNA. This is genetic material someone leaves behind without expectation of privacy. A coffee cup discarded in a public trash can, a cigarette but tossed on the ground, a napkin used and thrown away. It's legal, it's admissible, and it's how many cold cases get solved in the modern era. The team doesn't have to wait long. Baldwin stops at a convenience store, buys a drink, and tosses the cup in a public trash can when he's finished. The moment he drives away, investigators retrieve it. The cup goes to the lab, the DNA is extracted and processed. The match is unmistakable. The DNA from Clark Perry Baldwin's discarded cup matches the DNA from the crime scenes. The probability of error is astronomically small, 1 in several trillion. They've got him, but having DNA evidence and building a prosecutable case are different challenges. The investigators need to understand what happened, establish timelines, gather additional evidence. They need to connect Baldwin not just biologically but circumstantially to these crimes. The investigation intensifies. Financial records are subpoenaed, looking for unexplained expenses or travel during the relevant time periods. Witness statements from 30 years ago are re-examined, looking for details that might now make sense. Associates and family members are quietly interviewed, though without revealing the true purpose. The picture begins to emerge, not complete, but suggestive. Baldwin had opportunities. He had no solid alibis. He matches descriptions. And most damningly, he has the genetic profile that puts him at the scenes. The decision is made to move forward. On a day that probably starts like any other for Clark Perry Baldwin. Coffee, maybe some breakfast, the mundane routines of a man who thinks he's untouchable. Law enforcement arrives. Multiple vehicles, armed officers, arrest warrants. The look on his face must be something to behold. After 3 decades of freedom, of believing he'd escaped consequence, justice arrives at his door. The performance ends. The mask is ripped away. The invisible man becomes starkly, unavoidably visible. He's arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder: Sean Brown, Catherine Dyer, and Angela Hammond. The charges stem from the DNA evidence, from the circumstantial case built around him, from the patient, relentless work of investigators who refused to let these cases go cold. The news hits Waterloo like an earthquake. Neighbors are shocked. He seemed so normal, they say, because that's what neighbors always say. He was quiet, kept to himself. They remember him coaching youth sports, attending community events. They remember him as boring, unremarkable, forgettable. They never imagined they were living next to a serial killer. Baldwin's family is devastated. His wife, his children, they're suddenly thrust into a nightmare not of their making. They have to reconcile the man they knew, or thought they knew, with the monster being described in news reports. They have to process the possibility that someone they loved, someone they shared their lives with, is capable of the unthinkable. Some family members refuse to believe it. Not him, they insist. There must be a mistake. Denial is powerful, especially when accepting the truth means rewriting your entire understanding of your own life. Others are less certain, looking back through memories for signs they might have missed, moments when something seemed off. The victims' families receive the news with complex emotions. Relief that someone is finally being held accountable. Grief that resurfaces with renewed intensity. Anger that it took so long. Hope that they might finally get answers, that they might learn what happened to their daughters in those final moments. But there's also frustration because without recovered bodies, there are limits to what they'll ever know. Where are Sean, Catherine, and Angela? What did he do with them? Those questions haunt the families, and Baldwin isn't talking. He's lawyered up, exercising his right to remain silent, giving nothing away. The legal proceedings begin. Baldwin pleads not guilty, which is his right, though the evidence against him is substantial. His defense team will argue that DNA evidence isn't infallible, that genetic genealogy has limitations, that circumstantial evidence isn't proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They have an uphill battle. The prosecution builds their case methodically. They present the DNA evidence, explaining the science in terms jurors can understand. They present the circumstantial evidence, the timeline, the opportunity, the lack of alibi. They call witnesses who remember seeing someone matching Baldwin's description near the abduction sites. The trial becomes a media event, not because it's sensational in presentation, but because it represents something larger, the triumph of persistence over time, of science over evil, of justice delayed but not denied. Baldwin sits through it all, his face impassive. Even now, facing life imprisonment or worse, he maintains control. He doesn't break down. He doesn't confess. He simply waits, calculating odds, looking for weaknesses in the prosecution's case. The jury deliberates. Hours pass, then days. The families wait, barely breathing, 30 years of grief and hope compressed into this moment. The verdict will either validate their decades of searching or plunge them back into uncertainty. Finally, the jury returns. Guilty, on all counts. The word resonates through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Clark Perry Baldwin, the invisible man who evaded justice for 3 decades, has been found guilty of murdering Sean Brown, Catherine Dyer, and Angela Hammond. The jury, after examining the evidence, hearing testimony, and deliberating carefully, reached unanimous agreement. He did it. The DNA doesn't lie. The circumstances align. The pattern is undeniable. In the gallery, the victims' families react with cascading emotions. Some weep openly. Not tears of joy, because there's no joy in this, but tears of release, of validation, of a burden partially lifted. Others sit in stunned silence, processing that this moment they've dreamed about for decades has actually arrived. A few nod grimly, satisfaction mixing with exhaustion. 30 years. 3 decades of not knowing, of wondering, of hoping against hope that maybe their daughters were still alive somewhere, even though logic insisted otherwise. 30 years of birthdays and holidays celebrated around empty chairs, of anniversaries that mark absences rather than presences. The guilty verdict doesn't bring their daughters back. It doesn't erase the suffering. But it does something almost as important: it provides acknowledgement. Society, through the jury system, has officially recognized that these young women mattered, that their deaths demand accountability, that Clark Perry Baldwin doesn't get to walk free after destroying 3 families. Baldwin himself shows minimal reaction. No tears, no outburst, no dramatic breakdown. He simply stands when instructed, his expression carefully neutral, maintaining control even as his world collapses. This control, this ability to compartmentalize and suppress emotion, is what made him dangerous in the first place. It's what allowed him to kill and then return home to kiss his wife. It's what enabled him to live a double life for 30 years. And it's what makes him so utterly chilling even in defeat. The sentencing phase begins. In capital cases, and first-degree murder in Iowa carries the possibility of life imprisonment without parole. The defense presents mitigating factors, reasons the court should show mercy. Baldwin's attorneys argue that he has no prior criminal record, that he was a productive member of society, that his family needs him. The prosecution counters with victim impact statements. Sean Brown's mother takes the stand, decades of grief carved into her face. She speaks haltingly about her daughter, bright, funny, full of potential. She describes what it's like to wonder every single day for 30 years where your child is, if she suffered, if she called out for you in her final moments. She talks about birthdays spent visiting an empty grave, about holidays that became torture, about the way trauma fractures a family even when you're all in it together. Catherine Dyer's father speaks next. He's aged beyond his years, worn down by 3 decades of uncertainty. He describes his daughter's dreams, her plans for the future, all the milestones she never reached. He talks about becoming a grandfather, joy tainted by the knowledge that Catherine will never have children, never experience that particular form of love. He looks directly at Baldwin and asks simply, "Why? Why my daughter? What did she ever do to you?" Baldwin doesn't answer. He doesn't even look up. Angela Hammond's mother, fighting through tears, recounts the horror of that phone call from Rob Schaefer, the boyfriend who heard Angela's abduction in real time. She talks about the cruel hope that maybe, somehow, Angela escaped or was being held somewhere and might still come home. She describes how that hope transformed into something parasitic, eating away at her ability to function, to heal, to move forward. Each testimony is devastating. Each one chips away at whatever sympathy Baldwin's defense might have generated. These aren't abstract victims or statistics in a case file. They're real people with real families whose absences echo through generations. The judge listens carefully, taking notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. When the victim impact statements conclude, he allows time for Baldwin to speak if he wishes. Baldwin confers with his attorneys. They whisper urgently. This is his chance to show remorse, to humanize himself, to potentially impact his sentence. If he expresses genuine regret, it might soften the blow. He declines to speak. Even now, facing the consequences of his actions, he gives the families nothing. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of their suffering. It's one final act of cruelty, one last demonstration of his complete lack of empathy. The judge announces his decision. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on each count, sentences to run consecutively. Clark Perry Baldwin will die in prison. He will never again walk freely among the people he terrorized. He will spend whatever years remain to him in a cell, stripped of the normalcy he used as camouflage for so long. As he's led away in shackles, the families watch him go. Some feel satisfaction, others feel emptiness. The verdict and sentence, while necessary, don't fill the holes their daughters left behind. Justice and healing aren't the same thing. Outside the courthouse, media swarms the families. They face cameras and microphones, asked to summarize decades of trauma in a sound bite. Some decline to comment. Others speak briefly, thanking the investigators who never gave up, hoping that other families with missing loved ones might find similar resolution. The story makes national news. Clark Perry Baldwin becomes the latest in a long line of criminals caught by advancing forensic technology. Legal experts appear on television discussing the implications of genetic genealogy, debating privacy concerns versus public safety. True crime podcasts dissect every aspect of the case. But beyond the media spectacle, the real work continues. Law enforcement wants to know if there are other victims. Baldwin had 30 years of freedom, decades during which he could have been hunting. Are Sean, Catherine, and Angela the only ones, or are there more families out there still searching, still hoping? Investigators dig deeper into Baldwin's life. They examine his travel records, his employment history, any periods where he might have been in other locations. They look at unsolved disappearances and murders in neighboring states, searching for patterns that might connect to Baldwin. So far, nothing definitive has emerged. But the investigation remains open, the possibility hanging in the air that Baldwin's victim count might be higher than 3. His family faces their own nightmare. His wife files for divorce, whether out of genuine horror at what he did or simply to protect herself legally and financially, only she knows. His children grapple with profound identity crisis. Who are they now? The children of a serial killer? Do they owe their father loyalty? Or do they owe his victims justice? Can they mourn the loss of the man they thought they knew while simultaneously condemning what he actually is? Some family members speak publicly, expressing shock and apologizing to the victims' families. Others retreat from public view, trying to rebuild their lives away from the shadow of Baldwin's crimes. There's no right answer, no guidebook for what to do when your father is a murderer. The community of Waterloo has to reconcile with an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it drives a pickup truck and coaches Little League. Sometimes it lives next door and waves hello. Sometimes it hides so well that even those looking directly at it see nothing suspicious. This realization is disturbing because it strips away comforting illusions of safety. If Clark Perry Baldwin could be anyone, then anyone could be Clark Perry Baldwin. Trust becomes complicated. Paranoia can seem justified. But the alternative, living in constant fear, suspecting everyone, allowing one monster to poison all human interaction, is worse. Communities have to find balance between vigilance and paranoia, between caution and connection. For the 3 families, life continues in that strange space between closure and open wounds. They know who killed their daughters. They know he's been punished. But they don't have bodies to bury. They don't know exactly what happened in those final moments. They don't have complete answers, and they never will unless Baldwin decides to talk, something he's shown no indication of doing. Some find ways to channel their grief productively. They advocate for better resources for cold case investigations. They support other families dealing with missing persons cases. They work to ensure their daughters are remembered for who they were, not just how they died. Others struggle. 30 years of uncertainty followed by confirmation of your worst fears isn't something you simply get over. Therapy helps. Support groups help. But nothing truly heals a wound this deep. You just learn to live with it, to carry it as part of who you are now. The case of Clark Perry Baldwin closes, but its echoes continue. It becomes a teaching tool for law enforcement, an example of how persistence and advancing technology can crack seemingly impossible cases. It becomes a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming normalcy equals safety. And it becomes a reminder that justice, while sometimes slow, can still arrive. The invisible man is visible now, and he's running out of time. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Surgeon of Shadowed Halls. Lester Brocklehurst, aka the Angel of Silent Mercy. There are monsters who wear masks of violence, and then there are those who hide behind white coats and compassionate smiles, wielding death not with fury but with calculated precision. and Lester Brocklehurst proved that the most terrifying predators often lurk where we seek salvation. In the sterile corridors where humanity places its most vulnerable, where trust becomes a sacred contract between healer and patient, one man transformed his position of care into a throne of quiet devastation. He didn't hunt in darkness or strike with rage. Instead, he moved through fluorescent-lit hallways with gentle hands and a practiced bedside manner, administering death as if it were treatment, selecting victims who couldn't fight back, couldn't scream, couldn't even comprehend the betrayal occurring in their final moments. This is the account of a predator who weaponized compassion, who turned medicine into murder, and who believed himself a deity deciding who deserved to breathe and who should slip into eternal silence. What you're about to hear will disturb you not because of its brutality, but because of its cold, methodical nature, because Lester Brocklehurst killed not in passion, but with the detached efficiency of someone who believed he was performing a service. Welcome to a descent into one of healthcare's darkest chapters, where the hands meant to heal became instruments of calculated extermination. The machinery of death often begins not with violence, but with opportunity meeting twisted psychology. Lester Brocklehurst didn't arrive at his crimes through a single transformative moment of evil. Rather, he was shaped by years of inhabiting spaces where life and death existed in constant negotiation, where the fragile and elderly resided in states of dependence, where a caregiver's actions could mean survival or silent departure. He understood, perhaps better than most, that certain deaths raised fewer questions than others, that the passing of the aged, the infirm, the cognitively diminished often carried an air of inevitability that discouraged scrutiny. Born into circumstances that offered little indication of the horror he would eventually orchestrate, Brocklehurst's early years revealed a man drawn to positions of authority within caregiving environments. He sought employment in facilities housing those least capable of self-advocacy. Nursing homes, rehabilitation centers, assisted living communities where residents depended entirely on staff for their most basic needs. These weren't coincidental choices. These were strategic selections made by someone who recognized vulnerability as opportunity. His colleagues would later describe him with words that now carry sinister undertones. Attentive, dedicated, willing to take extra shifts, comfortable working nights when supervision thinned and corridors grew quiet. He volunteered for duties others avoided, the late-night rounds, the solitary monitoring of residents who required intensive observation, the care of patients whose conditions made them particularly helpless. Management praised his commitment. Families thanked him for his gentle manner. Meanwhile, behind this facade of professional devotion, something far darker was taking root. The psychological landscape of a medical murderer differs from that of conventional killers. Where others might require the adrenaline of confrontation or the satisfaction of domination, healthcare predators derive gratification from a perverse sense of control, from playing what they perceive as a godlike role in determining who lives and who dies. Brocklehurst exhibited classic markers of this pathology. An inflated sense of his own importance, a belief that he possessed special insight into which lives held value, and a disturbing comfort with the mechanics of mortality. His methodology developed gradually, refined through experimentation and observation. He studied how deaths were processed within institutional settings, noting which circumstances triggered investigations and which slipped past with routine paperwork. He learned that deaths occurring during nighttime hours, particularly among patients with existing serious medical conditions, received less aggressive scrutiny. He discovered that certain methods of killing left minimal traces, especially in bodies already compromised by age and illness. Most crucially, he recognized that healthcare facilities, chronically understaffed and overwhelmed, often defaulted to accepting death as a natural outcome rather than questioning whether intervention had hastened its arrival. The victims he selected shared characteristics that minimized risk to him while maximizing his sense of power. They were predominantly elderly, suffering from conditions that made unexpected decline plausible. Many had dementia or cognitive impairments that prevented them from articulating distress or recognizing danger. Some were nonverbal, communicating only through expressions that could be easily misinterpreted or ignored. Others had limited family contact, existing in the sad isolation that sometimes accompanies advanced age, their deaths noticed but not necessarily mourned with the intensity that might spark difficult questions. Brocklehurst's first confirmed killing, though likely not his first actual murder, occurred during a night shift when he found himself alone in a wing housing patients with severe cognitive decline. The victim, a woman in her 80s with advanced dementia, couldn't speak, couldn't understand where she was, couldn't recognize faces or form coherent thoughts. To Brocklehurst, she represented what he viewed as a mercy opportunity, someone he believed suffered needlessly, whose existence he considered diminished beyond value. This rationalization, common among medical murderers, allowed him to frame his actions as benevolent rather than criminal. The method he employed involved suffocation, not the violent, struggling suffocation of aggressive homicide, but a calculated application of pressure that restricted airflow until consciousness faded and death followed. He pressed a pillow over her face with steady, unyielding force, maintaining pressure even as her frail body attempted reflexive resistance. The entire process lasted several minutes, during which he remained calm, methodical, undisturbed by the life extinguishing beneath his hands. When it concluded, he arranged her body to suggest natural death during sleep, smoothed the bedding, adjusted her position, and documented her passing with fabricated details about declining vitals and peaceful expiration. No one questioned it. The death certificate listed natural causes. The family, accustomed to her deteriorated state, accepted the explanation without demanding autopsy. The facility processed the death through standard protocols, transferring the body to a funeral home where embalming would destroy any remaining evidence. Brocklehurst had successfully killed, and the ease with which he'd done so, the complete absence of consequences, served not as deterrent but as encouragement. The second murder followed weeks later, employing similar methodology but with increased confidence. Another elderly patient, this time a man with severe stroke-related disabilities who required total care for every basic function. Brocklehurst again waited for a night shift, again isolated the victim during hours when staffing reached minimum levels, again used suffocation to end life while manufacturing documentation that suggested natural decline. Again, no one questioned the death. The pattern was establishing itself. As his body count increased, Brocklehurst's behavior revealed the psychological progression typical of serial killers. Escalation in frequency, decreased time between murders, growing boldness in victim selection. What began as months between killings shortened to weeks, then to days. His victims expanded beyond those with the most severe impairments to include individuals with better cognitive function, people who possessed greater awareness of their surroundings, residents whose deaths would seem less inevitable. This wasn't merely about eliminating those he deemed to be suffering. This was about the power itself, the godlike authority to decide who would see another sunrise and who wouldn't, the thrill of operating undetected within a system designed to protect the very people he was systematically destroying. His methods diversified. While suffocation remained a primary technique, he began experimenting with other approaches. He administered medications in incorrect dosages, delivering fatal amounts of drugs to patients whose prescriptions he manipulated. He withheld necessary treatments, allowing conditions to deteriorate until death arrived from what appeared to be disease progression rather than deliberate neglect. He created circumstances that mimicked accidents, falls that weren't accidental, choking incidents that involved assistance rather than intervention, respiratory failures that he triggered rather than attempted to prevent. The facility where he worked became essentially a hunting ground, its halls transformed into corridors of death, its rooms into execution chambers. Residents who should have recovered instead declined mysteriously. Patients expected to stabilize instead suddenly crashed. The mortality rate, if anyone had thought to analyze it statistically, showed troubling elevation during shifts when Brocklehurst worked. But no one was looking at such data. No one suspected that death itself had taken employment among them. As Brocklehurst's confidence swelled, so too did the audacity of his crimes. What had begun as carefully selected targets during isolated night shifts evolved into a campaign of elimination that occurred across various times and circumstances. He had discovered something intoxicating, that institutional healthcare environments, despite their stated missions of preservation and care, could become perfect covers for systematic murder. The very systems designed to protect the vulnerable instead provided him with endless opportunity, minimal oversight, and built-in explanations for death. His victim count climbed steadily, though the exact number would remain subject to investigation and estimation. Conservative counts suggested dozens of murders. Less conservative assessments, based on mortality rate analysis during his employment periods, hinted at numbers potentially exceeding 100 deaths. The true total may never be definitively established, as many of his earliest victims had been cremated, their bodies destroyed before suspicion arose, their deaths accepted as natural and never reconsidered even after his eventual exposure. The geographic scope of his crimes expanded as he moved between facilities. Whether driven by restlessness, pursuit of new hunting grounds, or early suspicion that prompted strategic relocation, Brocklehurst changed employment multiple times throughout his killing career. Each new facility provided fresh victims, staff unfamiliar with his history, and institutional cultures he could learn to exploit. He left trails of elevated death rates behind him, patterns that would only become apparent during retrospective analysis, statistical anomalies that went unnoticed in real time but screamed significance once investigators began examining the data with suspicion rather than trust. The psychological evolution of a serial killer often involves diminishing satisfaction from repeated acts, requiring escalation to achieve the same gratification. Brocklehurst exhibited this progression through increasingly risky behaviors. He began killing during day shifts, not just nights. He selected victims with more family involvement, people whose deaths would spark greater emotional response and potentially more questions. He took less time between murders, sometimes killing multiple victims within single shifts, transforming particularly deadly days into what can only be described as sprees of extermination. One particularly horrific period saw him targeting residents within a single hallway over the course of consecutive nights. 5 individuals, ranging from their 70s to their 90s, died within a 72-hour window. All shared the same wing of the facility. All had received care from Brocklehurst during their final hours. All died during overnight shifts when he was among the limited staff present. The deaths were attributed to various causes: heart failure, respiratory arrest, stroke complications, natural decline. No one connected them. No one recognized the common thread until much later, when pattern analysis revealed the impossible coincidence of so many deaths clustered so tightly in time and space with such consistent caregiver presence. His suffocation technique refined with practice. He learned precisely how much pressure to apply, how to position pillows or his hands to restrict airflow while minimizing visible marks. He discovered that certain victim characteristics, advanced age, fragile skin, pre-existing bruising from medical procedures, helped mask the evidence of his violence. He timed his attacks to coincide with periods when other staff were occupied with medication rounds or resident assistance elsewhere, creating windows of opportunity where he could kill without interruption. The medication murders demonstrated equal calculation. He accessed pharmaceutical supplies with ease, his position providing legitimate reasons to handle controlled substances and lethal drugs. He administered overdoses of insulin to diabetic patients, creating hypoglycemic crises that mimicked natural medical emergencies. He injected air into intravenous lines, causing embolisms that stopped hearts while leaving minimal forensic evidence. He provided excessive doses of sedatives and opioids to residents whose prescriptions he falsified, documenting administration amounts that differed from what he actually delivered, ensuring that paperwork suggested proper care while actual actions brought death. Some victims died struggling, their final moments filled with confusion and terror as they recognized something wrong but couldn't comprehend or communicate the danger. Others slipped away unconscious, already sedated by medications that Brocklehurst had administered specifically to ease his killing process, to eliminate resistance and awareness, to transform murder into something resembling peaceful passing. The variation in victim experience didn't reflect mercy or consideration. It reflected only what served his purposes most effectively in specific circumstances. Families visiting their loved ones, sitting beside bedsides, holding hands, speaking words of comfort, remained oblivious to the fact that the caring professional checking vitals and adjusting equipment might have been responsible for the declining condition they were witnessing. Brocklehurst spoke to them with practiced sympathy, assured them that everything possible was being done, offered condolences when death arrived. He attended memorial services at the facility, stood among grieving relatives, accepted their thanks for the care he'd supposedly provided. The duplicity was absolute. His psychological state during this period revealed characteristics common among medical serial killers: a sense of omnipotence, belief in his superior judgment regarding quality of life, conviction that he was performing necessary acts others lacked the courage to execute. He viewed himself not as murderer but as angel of mercy, as someone who ended suffering, who released people from indignity, who possessed special insight into when life no longer warranted continuation. This self-justification, transparent in its self-serving distortion, allowed him to kill repeatedly without apparent emotional burden, to sleep peacefully after shifts spent ending lives, to continue presenting himself as dedicated caregiver while accumulating victim after victim. The facility environments themselves contributed to his success. Chronic understaffing meant fewer witnesses, longer periods of unsupervised access to residents, delayed discovery of deaths. Documentation systems focused on recording what happened rather than questioning whether reported events matched reality. Corporate structures prioritized efficiency and cost control over rigorous safety protocols. Regulatory oversight proved insufficient, with inspections examining paperwork compliance rather than investigating whether documentation reflected actual care quality. Within these institutional weaknesses, Brocklehurst found ample space to operate. Certain murders stood out for their particular cruelty or the vulnerability of their victims. One woman, still cognitively intact despite physical frailty, appeared to have recognized danger before Brocklehurst killed her, her medical chart containing a note about expressed fear of a staff member. A note that was dismissed as confusion, that went uninvestigated, that failed to protect her from the exact threat she tried to articulate. She died 2 days after recording her concern, suffocated during a night shift, her warning treated as symptom of decline rather than credible alert. Another victim, a man who had served his country in war, survived combat only to die at the hands of someone employed to care for him. His death involved insulin overdose, a particularly insidious method that caused his blood sugar to crash catastrophically, bringing seizures, unconsciousness, and eventually fatal organ failure. The process took hours of suffering that Brocklehurst observed with clinical detachment, documenting vitals as they deteriorated, noting symptoms without intervening to reverse the crisis he'd deliberately created. When death arrived, he recorded it as complication of diabetes management, a tragic but understandable outcome for someone with his medical history. The cumulative weight of these crimes, the sheer volume of lives extinguished, the systematic nature of the killing, established Brocklehurst as one of the most prolific murderers within healthcare settings. Each death represented not merely the ending of biological function but the betrayal of trust, the violation of vulnerability, the perversion of a profession dedicated to preservation. These weren't mercy killings, regardless of how he framed them. These were murders driven by power, control, and the psychological gratification derived from holding absolute authority over who lived and who died. Even the most careful predators eventually make mistakes, leave traces, create patterns recognizable to those looking with suspicious eyes. Brocklehurst's downfall began not with dramatic evidence or witness testimony, but with something more subtle: statistical analysis that revealed mortality rates inconsistent with normal expectations. The initial concerns came from outside the facilities where he worked, from regulatory reviewers examining data submissions that showed unusual death clustering during specific timeframes and in particular units. A healthcare consultant, reviewing mortality statistics as part of routine quality assessment, noticed anomalies that sparked questions. Certain shifts showed death rates significantly elevated compared to others. Particular caregivers appeared in documentation surrounding deaths with concerning frequency. When plotted temporally and geographically, the deaths formed patterns too consistent to attribute to coincidence, too concentrated to explain through natural variation. The consultant flagged these findings for further investigation, initiating a cascade of scrutiny that would eventually expose the horror Brocklehurst had been perpetrating. Initial investigations proceeded cautiously, mindfully aware that correlation doesn't necessarily prove causation, that elevated death rates might reflect complex factors unrelated to criminal activity. Administrators interviewed staff, reviewed policies, examined documentation for procedural violations. Brocklehurst, interviewed like other employees, presented himself as cooperative, professional, genuinely concerned about the deaths that had occurred during his care. He offered explanations for why his name appeared so frequently in death-related documentation. He volunteered for difficult shifts, he accepted assignment to the most critical patients, he was willing to provide end-of-life care that others found emotionally challenging. His answers seemed reasonable to investigators not yet considering criminal possibility, but deeper analysis revealed inconsistencies. Medication logs showed discrepancies, with recorded administration times and dosages not aligning with pharmaceutical inventory tracking. Witness statements, when collected systematically, included troubling details, residents expressing fear before deaths, family members noting their loved ones seemed worse after interactions with specific staff, colleagues mentioning unease about certain practices they'd observed but hadn't previously reported. The circumstantial evidence accumulated gradually, each piece individually insufficient for definitive conclusion but collectively suggestive of something profoundly wrong. The breakthrough came when investigators obtained permission to exhume bodies of several victims who'd been buried rather than cremated. Forensic examination revealed evidence inconsistent with natural death. Petechial hemorrhaging suggesting suffocation, toxicology findings indicating medication levels incompatible with documented administration, tissue analysis showing trauma patterns characteristic of force rather than natural decline. Suddenly, the investigation shifted from administrative inquiry to criminal homicide examination. Law enforcement became involved, bringing resources and legal authority beyond what internal institutional investigations possessed. Detectives interviewed hundreds of staff members, families, and witnesses. They subpoenaed complete employment and medical records. They consulted with forensic pathologists, toxicologists, and experts in medical serial murder. They constructed timeline analyses showing Brocklehurst's presence during virtually every suspicious death across multiple facilities over years of employment. The case against him strengthened with each layer of investigation. Brocklehurst, initially confident in his ability to deflect suspicion, began showing signs of psychological stress as the investigation intensified. Colleagues noticed changes in his demeanor, increased irritability, defensive responses to routine questions, unusual absences, apparent monitoring of what investigators were examining. His confidence, so absolute during his killing period, eroded under sustained scrutiny. He began making statements to coworkers that, while not outright confessions, revealed concerning mindsets, comments about mercy, quality of life, the burden of existence for severely impaired individuals. These statements, later documented through witness testimony, provided insight into his psychological justifications. The arrest, when it occurred, came with overwhelming force. Law enforcement executed warrants simultaneously at his residence and workplace, seizing documents, computers, personal items, and anything potentially connected to the murders. Brocklehurst was taken into custody without incident, his expression during arrest captured by media cameras showing not defiance or remorse but something closer to resignation, perhaps even relief that his secret existence was finally concluded. The charges filed against him were staggering in scope. Multiple counts of murder, each representing a death where evidence supported criminal causation. Prosecutors, aware that proving every suspected murder would be impossible given evidence degradation and time passage, focused on cases where forensic findings remained strongest, where documentation preserved clearest evidence, where witness testimony provided most compelling support. Even this selective prosecution resulted in dozens of murder charges, each carrying potential for life imprisonment. During interrogation, Brocklehurst initially maintained innocence, claiming that any deaths during his care resulted from natural causes and unfortunate timing. He portrayed himself as dedicated professional victimized by statistical coincidence and systematic scapegoating. But as investigators presented evidence, forensic findings, timeline analyses, witness statements, medication discrepancies, his defense crumbled. He began admitting to helping certain patients, framing his actions as compassionate responses to suffering. He described himself as someone willing to make difficult decisions others avoided, as someone who saw beyond institutional protocols to what he believed were patients' true interests. These admissions, recorded and documented, revealed his profound moral disconnection. He spoke about his victims as if they were already deceased before he killed them, as if their conditions rendered them effectively non-persons whose elimination constituted service rather than murder. He showed no emotional response when confronted with names and photographs of people he'd killed, treating them as abstract problems he'd solved rather than human beings he'd destroyed. The psychological evaluation conducted during this period identified him as possessing traits consistent with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders, with grandiose self-perception and profound empathy deficits. As more evidence emerged, the scope of his crimes expanded beyond what investigators initially suspected. Facility records from his various employment sites revealed mortality spikes consistently correlating with his presence. Families came forward with stories about loved ones who died unexpectedly, about concerns they'd raised that were dismissed, about suspicions they'd harbored but never pursued. The victim count, already horrifying, climbed higher with each revelation. Facilities where he'd worked became crime scenes subject to comprehensive investigation, their records scrutinized, their practices questioned, their corporate structures examined for failures that enabled such extensive killing. The media coverage transformed the case into national horror story, with headlines emphasizing the betrayal of trust, the vulnerability of victims, the systematic nature of the crimes. Brocklehurst became symbol of healthcare's darkest possibilities, representation of what happens when positions of care become opportunities for predation. Public response combined outrage with fear, recognition that the most dangerous predators sometimes wear uniforms of healing, that vulnerability creates opportunities for those twisted enough to exploit it. Families of victims, learning that their loved ones hadn't died naturally but had been murdered, experienced complex trauma. Grief compounded by rage, loss intensified by betrayal, mourning complicated by knowledge that final moments involved not peace but violence. Support groups formed, comprising people united by shared victimization, by the common experience of having trusted institutions that failed to protect those they promised to care for. Their advocacy would later drive reforms in healthcare oversight, changes in monitoring protocols, improvements in staff screening processes. The legal proceedings advanced toward trial, with prosecution building comprehensive case demonstrating pattern, methodology, and overwhelming evidence of guilt. Defense attorneys, facing nearly insurmountable evidence, explored plea negotiations that might spare their client death penalty consideration in exchange for complete confession and cooperation with investigators attempting to identify all victims. These negotiations revealed the full extent of horror. Brocklehurst admitted to murders spanning years, to victim counts far exceeding initial charges, to kills in facilities beyond those previously investigated. His confession, when finally obtained, documented one of the most extensive healthcare serial murder cases in recorded history. The courtroom proceedings that followed Brocklehurst's confession provided public forum for confronting the magnitude of his crimes. Though plea negotiations eliminated need for trial, sentencing hearings became venues where families could address him directly, where the human cost of his actions received voice, where justice system attempted to impose consequences proportional to the devastation he'd caused. These proceedings, emotionally raw and psychologically difficult, forced examination of how someone could kill so extensively for so long within systems supposedly designed to prevent exactly such horrors. Victim impact statements filled hours of court time, with family members describing loved ones not as anonymous elderly patients but as individuals with histories, personalities, relationships, and value. They spoke about mothers who'd raised children, fathers who'd built businesses, veterans who'd served their country, teachers who'd educated generations, artists who'd created beauty, ordinary people who'd lived meaningful lives that deserved natural conclusions rather than violent terminations. Each statement personalized victims Brocklehurst had treated as mere opportunities, restored humanity to people he'd reduced to targets, honored lives he'd arrogantly decided to end. The emotional testimony often overwhelmed courtroom participants. Family members broke down describing how they'd sat beside deathbeds holding hands with people being murdered, how they'd thanked Brocklehurst for his care while he was actively killing their relatives, how they'd accepted reassurances about inevitable decline from the person causing that decline. The betrayal cut multiple layers. Not just the murders themselves, but the deception, the manipulation, the exploitation of grief, the perversion of trust. Some families directed anger at Brocklehurst personally, demanding acknowledgement of what he'd destroyed. Others focused rage on institutional failures that enabled him, on systems that prioritized efficiency over safety, on corporate structures that valued cost control over comprehensive oversight. Brocklehurst's own statement, when he finally addressed the court, revealed continued psychological distortion. He apologized in abstract terms while simultaneously defending his actions as motivated by compassion. He claimed to have ended suffering, to have provided relief to people trapped in diminished existence, to have performed services others lacked courage to provide. Even facing multiple life sentences, he couldn't fully accept that he'd committed profound evil rather than difficult mercy. Mental health experts would later identify this persistent self-justification as characteristic of medical serial killers, who frequently maintain distorted belief systems that frame their murders as beneficent rather than criminal. The judge, tasked with imposing sentence, delivered statement emphasizing the exceptional depravity of Brocklehurst's crimes. The court noted that his victims were among society's most vulnerable, that they'd been killed by someone sworn to protect them, that the betrayal of trust elevated his crimes beyond ordinary murder into something particularly heinous. The sentence handed down reflected this gravity. Multiple consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, ensuring Brocklehurst would die imprisoned, that he would never again have opportunity to harm vulnerable individuals, that his remaining years would be spent in confinement rather than freedom. The judge's final words to him emphasized that his victims hadn't needed his mercy. They'd needed his care, which he'd catastrophically failed to provide. The institutional aftermath extended far beyond Brocklehurst's individual prosecution. Facilities where he'd worked faced civil litigation from victims' families, resulting in multimillion-dollar settlements and admissions of failed oversight. Corporate structures underwent reorganization, with leadership changes and policy implementations designed to prevent similar future horrors. Regulatory bodies revised inspection protocols, mandating more rigorous mortality reviews, requiring statistical analysis of death rates across shifts and caregivers, implementing whistleblower protections for staff reporting concerns about colleagues. These reforms, prompted by recognition of how extensively systems had failed, represented attempts to ensure that future predators would face detection before accumulating comparable victim counts. Legislative responses included enhanced criminal penalties for healthcare workers who abuse positions of trust, mandatory reporting requirements for suspicious death patterns, and funding increases for medical examiner offices to conduct more thorough investigations of deaths in care facilities. Several jurisdictions passed laws specifically named after Brocklehurst's victims, memorializing them while establishing protections designed to prevent repetition of the failures that cost them their lives. These legal changes acknowledged that existing systems had proven inadequate, that something as catastrophic as his killing spree demanded comprehensive reform. The healthcare industry more broadly grappled with uncomfortable questions Brocklehurst's crimes raised. How could someone kill so extensively without detection? What organizational cultures enable such predation? How can institutions balance operational efficiency with safety monitoring? What screening processes might identify potential healthcare serial killers before they gain access to vulnerable populations? These questions drove conferences, research studies, training programs, and professional soul-searching about whether medicine's emphasis on trust and autonomy creates exploitable vulnerabilities. Scholarly analysis of Brocklehurst's case contributed to growing literature on medical serial murder, providing data that helped researchers better understand motivations, methodologies, and warning signs associated with healthcare predators. Psychological profiles developed from his case informed training programs teaching administrators and staff to recognize concerning patterns. His crimes became case study in criminology courses, in healthcare ethics curricula, in regulatory training programs, serving as cautionary example of what can occur when multiple system failures align to enable predatory behavior. The victims' families organized advocacy groups focused on healthcare safety, patient rights, and institutional accountability. They lobbied for legislative reforms, participated in facility oversight committees, provided testimony to regulatory bodies, and worked to ensure their loved ones' deaths contributed to positive change that might protect others. Their efforts transformed personal tragedy into public advocacy, channeling grief into productive action aimed at preventing future families from experiencing similar devastation. Years after sentencing, Brocklehurst remains imprisoned, his name synonymous with healthcare betrayal, his crimes serving as benchmark against which other medical serial murders are measured. He grants occasional interviews to researchers studying criminal psychology. Though these conversations reveal little additional insight, he continues framing his actions as misunderstood compassion rather than accepting them as calculated murder. He expresses no genuine remorse recognizable to mental health professionals who've evaluated him, suggesting that his moral disconnection remains profound and likely permanent. The long-term impact on surviving residents of facilities where he worked proved significant. Many experienced heightened anxiety around caregiving interactions, developed trust issues with medical professionals, struggled with knowledge that they'd unknowingly coexisted with serial killer. Support services provided counseling and reassurance, though the psychological wounds from proximity to such evil healed slowly, if at all. These indirect victims, people who survived Brocklehurst's employment but lived with awareness of danger they'd faced, represented additional layer of harm his crimes produced. The case permanently altered how certain medical deaths are investigated. Coroners and medical examiners now apply greater scrutiny to deaths in care facilities, particularly when patterns suggest unusual clustering or when single caregiver appears repeatedly in death documentation. This increased vigilance has led to earlier detection of other healthcare serial killers, preventing them from accumulating victim counts comparable to Brocklehurst's. In this sense, the horror he inflicted inadvertently contributed to improved protections, though at unconscionable cost. The question of whether death penalty would have been appropriate punishment generated debate among legal scholars and ethicists. Supporters argued that the scale and nature of his crimes merited ultimate sanction, that someone who systematically murdered vulnerable people in settings specifically designed to protect them deserved society's harshest response. Opponents noted that life imprisonment without parole already ensures he'll never harm anyone again, that execution might grant him martyrdom he doesn't deserve, that his continued existence serves valuable research and educational purposes. The resolution, multiple consecutive life sentences, effectively guaranteed he'll die in prison regardless, making the death penalty debate largely academic. The families continue processing grief complicated by circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. Traditional mourning assumes natural or accidental death, but murder, especially murder by trusted caregiver, creates different psychological challenges. Therapy, support groups, and time provide some healing, though many describe permanent alteration in how they view healthcare systems, trust medical professionals, and experience the vulnerability inherent in aging and illness. Brocklehurst's crimes didn't just kill his direct victims. They wounded entire networks of people who loved them, trusted him, and must now live with knowledge of how catastrophically that trust was violated. The story concludes not with redemption or closure, but with sobering recognition that evil sometimes inhabits unexpected places, that the most dangerous predators occasionally wear guises of compassion, and that vigilance remains essential even in environments explicitly dedicated to care. Lester Brocklehurst's crimes serve as permanent reminder that trust must be accompanied by verification, that positions of authority over vulnerable populations require robust oversight, and that the capacity for profound evil exists even among those who present themselves as healers. His victims deserved better care, better protection, better systems. Their memory demands continued commitment to ensuring that healthcare environments truly serve as sanctuaries rather than hunting grounds for those twisted enough to exploit the vulnerable. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.